Chapter 15 of Flower of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Flower of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 15. Not until the silken flap of the tent had fallen behind Jeanne did power of movement and speech return to Philip. He called her name and straggled to a sitting posture. Then he staggered to his feet. He could scarcely stand. Shooting pains passed like flashes of electricity through his body. His right arm was numb and stiff, and he found that it was thickly bandaged. His head ached, his legs could hardly support him. He went to raise his left hand to his head, but stopped it in front of him, while a slow smile of understanding crept over his face. It was swollen and covered with livid bruises. He wondered if his body looked that way, and sank down exhausted upon his balsam bed. A minute later Pierre returned with a cup of broth in his hand. Philip looked at him with less feverish eyes now. There was an unaccountable change in the half-breed's appearance, as there had been in Jeanne's. His face seemed thinner. There was a deep gloom in his eyes, a dejected droop to his shoulders. Philip accepted the broth and drank it slowly, without speaking. He felt strengthened. Then he looked steadily at Pierre. The old pride had fallen from Pierre like a mask. His eyes dropped under Philip's gaze. Philip held up a hand. "Pierre!" The half-breed grasped it and waited. His lips tightened. "What is the matter?" demanded Philip. "What has happened to Jeanne? You say she was not hurt." "By the rocks, monsieur," interrupted Pierre quickly, kneeling beside Philip. "Listen, it is best that I tell you. You are a man. You will understand, without being told all. From Churchill I brought news which it was necessary for me to tell Jeanne. It was terrible news, and she is distressed under its weight. Your honor will not allow you to inquire further, monsieur. I can tell you no more than this, that it is a grief which belongs to but one person on earth, herself. I ask you to help me. Be blind to her unhappiness, monsieur. Believe that it is the distress of the peril through which she has passed. A little later I will tell you all, and you will understand. But it is impossible now. I confide this much in you. I ask you this because—" Pierre's eyes were half closed, and he looked as though unseeing over Philip's head. "I ask you this," he repeated softly, "because I have guessed that you love her." A cry of joy burst from Philip's lips. "I do, Pierre. I do. I do." "I have guessed it," said Pierre. "You will help me to save her." "Until death." "Then you will go with us to Fort o' God, and from there you will go at once to your camp on Blind Indian Lake." Philip felt the sweat breaking out over his face. He was still weak. His voice was unnatural and trembled. "You know?" he gasped. "Yes, I know, monsieur," replied Pierre. "I know that you are in charge there, and Jeanne knows. We knew who you were before we appointed to meet you on the cliff. You must return to your men." Philip was silent. For the moment every hope was crushed within him. He looked at Pierre. The half-breed's eyes were glowing, his haggard cheeks were flushed. "And this is necessary?" "It is absolutely necessary, monsieur." "Then I will go. But first, Pierre, I must know a little more. I cannot go entirely blind. Do they fear my men at Fort o' God?" "No, monsieur." "One more question, Pierre. Who is Lord Fitzhugh Lee?" For an instant Pierre's eyes widened. They grew black and burned with a strange, threatening fire. He rose slowly to his feet and placed both hands upon Philip's shoulders. For a full minute the two men stared into each other's face. Then Pierre spoke. His voice was soft and low, scarcely above a murmur, but it was filled with something that struck a chill to Philip's heart. "I would kill you before I would answer that question, monsieur," he said. "No other person has ever done for Jeanne and I what you have done. We owe you more than we can ever repay. Yet if you insist upon an answer to that question, you make of me an enemy. If you breathe that name to Jeanne, you turn her away from you forever." Without another word he left the tent. For many minutes Philip sat motionless where Pierre had left him. The earth seemed suddenly to have dropped from under his feet, leaving him in an illimitable chaos of mind. Gregson had deserted him, with almost no word of explanation, and he would have staked his life upon Gregson's loyalty. Under other circumstances his unaccountable action would have been a serious blow. But now it was overshadowed by the mysterious change that had come over Jeanne. A few hours before she had been happy, laughing and singing as they drew nearer to Fort o' God. Each hour had added to the brightness of her eyes, the gladness in her voice. The change had come with Pierre, and at the bottom of it all was Lord Fitzhugh Lee. Pierre had warned him not to mention Lord Fitzhugh's name to Jeanne, and yet only a short time before he had spoken the name boldly before Jeanne, and she had betrayed no sign of recognition or of fear. More than that, she had assured him that she had never heard the name before, that it was not known at Fort o' God. Philip bowed his head in his hands, and his fingers clutched in his hair. What did it all mean? He went back to the scene on the cliff, when Pierre had roused himself at the sound of the name. He thought of all that had happened since Gregson had come to Churchill, and the result was a delirium of thought that made his temples throb. He was sure, now, of but few things. He loved Jeanne, loved her more than he had ever dreamed that he could love a woman, and he believed that it would be impossible for her to tell him a falsehood. He was confident that she had never heard of Lord Fitzhugh until Pierre overtook them in their flight from Churchill. He could see but one thing to do, and that was to follow Pierre's advice, accepting his promise that in the end everything would come out right. He had faith in Pierre. He rose to his feet and went to the tent flap. An embarrassing thought came to him, and he stopped, a flush of feverish color suddenly mounting into his pale cheeks. He had kissed Jeanne in the chasm, when death thundered in their faces. He had kissed her again and again, and in those kisses he had declared his love. He was glad and yet sorry. The knowledge that she must know of his love filled him with happiness, and yet with it there was the feeling that it would place a distance between him and Jeanne. Jeanne was the first to see him when he came out of the tent. She was sitting beside a small balsam shelter, and Pierre was busy over a fire, with his back turned to them. For a moment the two looked at each other in silence, and then Jeanne came toward him, holding out one of her hands. He saw that she was making a strong effort to appear natural, but there was something in his own face that made her attempt a poor one. The hand that she gave him trembled. Her lips quivered. For the first time her eyes failed to meet his own in their limpid frankness. "Pierre has told you what happened," she said. "It was a miracle, and I owe you my life. I have had my punishment for being so careless." She tried to laugh at him now, and drew her hand away. "I wasn't beaten against the rocks like you, but—" "It was terrible," interrupted Philip, remembering Pierre's words, and eager to put her at ease. "You have stood up under it beautifully. I am afraid of after effects. You must not collapse under the strain now." Pierre heard his last words, and a smile flashed over his dark face as he encountered Philip's glance. "It is true, monsieur," he said. "I know of no other woman who would have stood up under such a thing as Jeanne has done. Mon Dieu, when I found a part of the canoe wreckage far below, I thought that both of you were dead." Philip began to feel that he had foolishly overestimated his strength. There was a weakness in his limbs that surprised him, and a sudden chill replaced the fever in his blood. Jeanne placed her hand upon his arm and thrust him gently toward the tent. "You must not exert yourself," she said, watching the pallor in his face. "You must be quiet until after dinner." He obeyed the pressure of her hand. Pierre followed into the tent, and for a moment he was compelled to lean heavily upon the half-breed. "It is the reaction, monsieur," said Pierre. "You are weak after the fever. If you could sleep—" "I can," murmured Philip, dizzily, dropping upon his balsam. "But, Pierre—" "Yes, monsieur." "I have something—to say to you. No questions." "Not now, monsieur." Philip heard the rustling of the flap, and Pierre was gone. He felt more comfortable lying down. Dizziness and nausea left him, and he slept. It was the deep, refreshing sleep that always follows the awakening from fever. When he awoke he felt like his old self, and went outside. Pierre was alone. A blanket was drawn across the front of the balsam shelter, and the half-breed nodded toward it in response to Philip's inquiring glance. Philip ate lightly of the food which Pierre had ready for him. When he had finished he leaned close to him and said, "You have warned me to ask no questions, and I am going to ask none. But you have not forbidden me to tell you things which I know. I am going to talk to you about Lord Fitzhugh Lee." Pierre's dark eyes flashed. "Monsieur." "Listen," demanded Philip. "I seek your confidence no further. But I shall tell you what I know of Lord Fitzhugh Lee if it makes us fight. Do you understand? I insist upon this, because you have as good as told me that this man is your enemy, and that he is at the bottom of Jeanne's trouble. He is also my enemy. And after I have told you why, you may change your determination to keep me a stranger to your trouble. If not, well, you can hold your tongue then as well as now." Quickly, without moving his eyes from Pierre's face, Philip told his own story of Lord Fitzhugh Lee. And as he continued a strange change came over the half-breed. When he came to the letters revealing the plot to turn the northerners against his company a low cry escaped Pierre's lips. His eyes seemed starting from his head. Drops of sweat burst out upon his face. His fingers worked convulsively, something rose in his throat and choked him. When Philip had done he buried his face in his hands. For a few moments he remained thus, and then suddenly looked up. Livid spots burned in his cheeks, and he fairly hissed at Philip. "Monsieur, if this is not the truth, if this is a lie—" He stopped. Something in Philip's eyes told him to go no further. He was fearless, and he saw more than fearlessness in Philip's face. Such men believe when they come together. "It is the truth," said Philip. With a low, strained laugh Pierre held out his hand as a pledge of his faith. "I believe in you, monsieur," he said, and it seemed an effort for him to speak. "Do you know what I would have thought if you had told this to Jeanne before I came?" "No." "I would have thought, monsieur, that she threw herself purposely into the death of the Big Thunder Rocks." "My God! You mean—" "That is all, monsieur. I can say no more." "Ah, there is Jeanne!" he cried, more loudly. "Now we will take down the tent and go." Jeanne stood a dozen steps behind them when Philip turned. She greeted him with a smile and hastened to assist Pierre in gathering up the things about the camp. Philip was not blind to her efforts to evade him. He could see that it was a relief to her when they were at last in Pierre's canoe and headed up the river. They traveled till late in the evening, and set up Jeanne's tent by starlight. The journey was continued at dawn. Late the following afternoon the Little Churchill swept through a low, woodless country called the White Fox Barren. It was a narrow barren, and across it lay the forest and the Ridge Mountains. Behind these mountains and the forest the sun was setting. Above all else there rose out of the gathering gloom of evening a single ridge, a towering mass of rock which caught the last glow of the sun, and blazed like a signal fire. The canoe stopped. Jeanne and Pierre both gazed toward the great rock. Then Jeanne, who was in the bow, turned her face to Philip, and the glow of the rock itself suffused her cheeks as she pointed over the barren. "M'sieur Philip," she said, "there is Fort o' God." End of chapter 15. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 16 of Flower of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Flower of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 16. There was a low tremble in Jeanne's voice. The canoe swung broadside to the slow current, and Philip looked in astonishment at the change in Pierre. The tired half-breed had uncovered his head, and knelt with his face turned to that last crimson glow in the sky, like one in prayer. But his eyes were open, there was a smile on his lips, and he was breathing quickly. Pride and joy came where there had been the lines of grief and exhaustion. His shoulders were thrown back, his head erect, and the fire of the distant rock reflected itself in his eyes. From him Philip turned, so that he could look into Jeanne's face. The girl, too, had changed. Again these two were the Pierre and Jeanne whom he had seen that first night on the moonlit cliff. Pierre seemed no longer the half-breed, but the prince of the rapier and broad cuffs, and Jeanne, smiling proudly at Philip, made him an exquisite little curtsy from her cramped seat in the bow, and said, "M'sieur Philip, welcome to Fort o' God." "Thank you," he said, and stared toward the sun-capped rock. He could see nothing but the rock, the black forests, and the desolate barren stretching between. Fort o' God, unless it was the rock itself, was still a mystery hidden in the gathering gloom. The canoe began moving slowly onward, and Jeanne turned so that her eyes searched the stream ahead. A thick wall of stunted forest shut out the barren from their view. The stream grew narrower, and on the opposite side a barren ridge, threatening them with torn and upheaved masses of rock, flung the heavy shadows of evening down upon them. No one spoke. Philip could hear Pierre breathing behind him. Something in the intense quiet, in the awesome effect which their approach to Fort o' God had upon these two, sent strange little thrills shooting through his body. He listened and heard nothing, not even the howl of a dog. The stillness was oppressive, and the darkness thickened about them. For half an hour they continued, and then Pierre headed the canoe into a narrow creek, thrusting it through a thick growth of wild rice and reeds. Balsam and cedar and swamp hazel shut them in. Overhead the tall cedars interlaced and hid the pale light of the sky. Philip could just make out Jeanne ahead of him. And then suddenly there came a wonderful change. They shot out of the darkness, as if from a tunnel, but so quietly that one a dozen feet away could not have heard the ripple of Pierre's paddle. Almost in their faces rose a huge black bulk, and in that blackness 3 or 4 yellow lights gleamed like mellow stars. The canoe touched noiselessly upon sand. Pierre sprang out, still without sound. Jeanne followed with a whispered word. Philip was last. Pierre pulled the canoe up, and Jeanne came to Philip. She held out her 2 hands. Her face shone white in the gloom, and there was a look in her beautiful eyes, as she stood for a moment almost touching him, that set his heart jumping. She let her hands lie in his while she spoke. "We have not even alarmed the dogs, M'sieur Philip," she whispered. "Is not that splendid? I am going to surprise father, and you will go with Pierre. I will see you a little later, and—" She rose on tiptoe, and her face was dangerously close to his own. "And you are very, very welcome to Fort o' God, M'sieur." She slipped away into the darkness, and Pierre stood beside Philip. His white teeth were gleaming strangely, and he said in a soft voice: "M'sieur, that is the first time that I have ever heard those words spoken at Fort o' God. We welcome no man here who has your blood and your civilization in his veins. You are greater than a king." With a sudden exclamation Philip turned upon Pierre. "And that is the reason for Jeanne's surprise?" he said. "She wishes to pave a way for me. I begin to understand." "It is true that you might not have received that welcome which you are certain to receive now from the master of Fort o' God," replied Pierre frankly. "So we will go in quietly, and make no disturbance, while your way is being paved, as you call it." He walked ahead, with Philip following so closely that he could have touched him. He made out more distinctly now the lines of the huge black edifice from which the lights shone. It was a massive structure of logs, 2 stories high, a half of it almost completely hidden in the impenetrable shadow of a great wall of rock. Philip's eyes traveled up this wall, and he was convinced that he stood under the rock upon whose towering crest he had seen the last reflection of the evening sun. About him there were no signs of life or of other habitation. Pierre moved swiftly. They passed under a small lighted window that was a foot above Philip's head, and turned around the corner of the building. Here all was blackness. Pierre went straight to a door and uttered a low word of satisfaction when he found that it was not barred. He opened it and reached out a guiding hand to Philip's arm. Philip entered, and the door closed softly behind him. He felt the flow of warm air in his face, and his moccasined feet trod upon something soft and velvety. Faintly, as though coming from a great distance, he heard a voice singing. It was a woman's voice, but he knew that it was not Jeanne's. In spite of himself his heart was beating excitedly. The mystery of Fort o' God was about him, warm and subtle, like a strange spirit, sending through him the thrill of anticipation, 100 fancies, little fears. Pierre advanced, still guiding him. Then he stopped and chuckled softly in the darkness. The distant voice had stopped singing, and there came in place of it the loud barking of a dog, an unintelligible sound of a voice, and then quiet. Jeanne had sprung her surprise. Pierre led the way to another room. "This is to be your room, monsieur," he explained. "Make yourself comfortable. I have no doubt that the master of Fort o' God will wish to see you very soon." He struck a match as he spoke and lighted a lamp. A moment more and he was gone. Philip looked about him. He was in a room fully 20 feet square, furnished in a manner that drew from him an audible gasp of astonishment. At one end of the room was a massive mahogany bed, screened by heavy curtains which were looped back by silken cords. Near the bed was an old-fashioned mahogany dresser, with a diamond-shaped mirror, and in front of it a straight-backed chair adorned with the grotesque carving of an ancient and long-dead fashion. About him everywhere were the evidences of luxury and of age. The big lamp, which gave a brilliant light, was of hammered brass. The base of its square pedestal was partly hidden in the rumples of a heavy damask spread which covered the table on which it rested. The table itself was old, spindle-legged, glowing with the mellow luster endowed by many passing generations, a relic of the days when the originator of its fashion became the favorite of a capricious and beautiful queen. Soft rugs were upon the floor. From the walls, papered and hung with odd bits of tapestry, strange faces looked down upon Philip from out of heavy gilded frames. Faces grim, pale, shadowed, men with plaited ruffles and curls, women with powdered hair, who gazed down upon him haughtily, as if they wondered at his intrusion. One picture was turned with its face to the wall. Philip sank into a huge armchair, cushioned with velvet, and dropped his cap upon the floor. And this was Fort o' God! He scarcely breathed. He was back 2 centuries, and he stared, as if each movement he expected some manifestation of life in what he saw. He had dreamed his dream over the dead at Churchill. Here it was reality, almost. It lacked but a breath, a movement, a flutter of life in the dead faces that looked down upon him. He gazed up at them again, and laughed a little nervously. Then he fixed his eyes on the opposite wall. One of the pictures was moving. The thought in his brain had given birth to the movement he had imagined. It was a woman's face in the picture, young and beautiful, and it nodded to him, one moment radiant with light, the next caught in shadows that cast over it a gloom. He jumped from his chair and went so that he stood directly under it. A current of warm air shot up into his face from the floor. It was this air that was causing movement in the picture, and he looked down. What he discovered broke the spell he was under. About him were the relics of age, of a life long dead. Rubens might have sat in that room and mourned over his handiwork, lost in a wilderness. The stingy Louis might have recognized in the spindle-legged table a bit of his predecessor's extravagance, which he had sold for the good of the exchequer of France. A goblin might have reclaimed one of the woven landscapes on the wall, a Grosellier himself have issued from behind the curtained bed. Philip himself, in that environment, was the stranger. It was the current of warm air which brought him back from the 18th to the 20th century. Under his feet was a furnace. Even the master of Fort o' God, stern and forbidding as Philip began to imagine him, might have laughed at the look which came into his face. Grosellier, the cavalier, had he appeared, Philip would have accepted with the same confidence that he had accepted Jeanne and Pierre. But a furnace? He thrust his hands deep in his pockets, a trick which was always the last convincing evidence of his perplexity, and walked slowly around the room. There were 2 books on the table. One, bound in faded red vellum, was a Greek anthology, the other Drummond's Ascent of Man. There were other books on a quaintly carved shelf, under the picture which had been turned to the wall. He ran over the titles. There were a number of French novels, Eli's Socialism, Sir Thomas More's Utopia, St. Pierre's Paul and Virginia, and a dozen other volumes. There were Balzac and Hugo and Dante's Divine Comedy. Amid this array, like a black sheep lost among the angels, was a finger-worn and faded little volume bearing the name Camille. Something about this one book, so strangely out of place in its present company, aroused Philip's curiosity. It bore the name, too, which he had found worked in the corner of Jeanne's handkerchief. In a way, the presence of this book gave him a sort of shock, and he took it in his hands and opened the cover. Under his fingers were pages yellow and frayed with age, and in an ancient type, once black, the title, "The Meaning of God." In a large masculine hand someone had written under this title the accompanying words, "A black skin often contains a white soul. A woman's beauty, hell." Philip replaced the book with a feeling of awe. Something in those words, brutal in their truth, something in the strange whim that had placed a pearl of purity within the faded and worn mask of the condemned, seemed to speak to him of a tragedy that might be a key to the mystery of Fort o' God. From the books he looked up at the picture which had been turned to the wall. The temptation to see what was hidden overcame him, and he turned the frame over. Then he stepped back with a low cry of pleasure. From out of the prescribed canvas there smiled down upon him a face of bewildering beauty. It was the face of a young woman, a stranger among its companions, because it was of the present. Philip stepped to one side so that the light from the lamp shone from behind him, and he wondered if the picture had been condemned to hang with its face to the wall because it typified the existent rather than the past. He looked more closely and drew back step by step until he was in the proper focus to bring out every expression in the lovely face. In the picture he saw each moment a greater resemblance to Jeanne. The eyes, the hair, the sweetness of the mouth, the smile, brought to him a vision of Jeanne herself. The woman in the picture was older than Jeanne, and his first thought was that it must be a sister or her mother. It came to him in the next breath that this would be impossible, for Jeanne had been found by Pierre in the deep snows, on her dead mother's breast. And this was a painting of life, of youth, of beauty, and not of death and starvation. He returned the forbidden picture to the position in which he had found it against the wall, half ashamed of the act and thoughts into which his curiosity had led him. And yet, after all, it was not curiosity. He told himself that as he washed himself and groomed his disheveled clothes. An hour had passed when he heard a low tap at the door, and Pierre came in. In that time the half-breed had undergone a transformation. He was dressed in an exquisite coat of yellow buckskin, with the same old-fashioned cuffs he had worn when Philip first saw him, trousers of the same material, buckled below the knees, and boot moccasins with flaring tops. He wore a new rapier at his waist, and his glossy black hair was brushed smoothly back and fell loose upon his shoulders. It was the courtier, and not Pierre the half-breed, who bowed to Philip. "Monsieur, are you ready?" he asked. "Yes," replied Philip. "Then we will go to Monsieur d'Arcambal, the master of Fort o' God." They passed out into the hall, which was faintly illumined now, so that Philip caught glimpses of deep shadows and massive doors as he followed behind Pierre. They turned into a second hall, at the end of which was an open door through which came a flood of light. At this door Pierre stopped, and with a bow allowed his companion to pass in ahead of him. The next moment Philip stood in a room twice as large as the one he had left. It was brilliantly lighted by 3 or 4 lamps. He had only an instant's vision of numberless shelves loaded with books, of walls covered with pictures, of a ponderous table in front of him, and then he heard a voice. A man stepped out from behind the door, and he stood face to face with the master of Fort o' God. End of chapter 16. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 17 of Flower of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Flower of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 17. He was an old man. Beard and hair were white. He was as tall as Philip. His shoulders were broader. His chest massive. And as he stood under the light of one of the hanging lamps, his face shining with a pale glow, one hand upon his breast, the other extended, it seemed to Philip that all of the greatness and past glory of Fort o' God, whatever they may have been, were personified in the man he beheld. He was dressed in soft buckskin, like Pierre. His hair and beard grew in wild disorder, and from under shaggy eyebrows there burned a pair of deep-set eyes of the color of blue steel. He was a man to inspire awe, old and yet young, white-haired, gray-faced, and yet a giant. One might have expected from between his bearded lips a voice as thrilling as his appearance, a rumbling voice, deep-chested, sonorous, and it would have caused no surprise. It was the voice that surprised Philip more than the man. It was low and trembling with an agitation which even strength and pride could not control. "Philip Wetmore, I am Henry d'Arcambal. May God bless you for what you have done." A hand of iron gripped his own, and then, before Philip had found words to say, the master of Fort o' God suddenly placed his arms about the shoulders and embraced him. Their shoulders touched. Their faces were close. The two men who loved Jeanne d'Arcambal above all else on earth gazed for a silent moment into each other's eyes. "They have told me," said d'Arcambal softly, "you have brought my Jeanne home through death. Accept a father's blessing, and with it this." He stepped back and swept his arms about the great room. Everything would have gone with her," he said. "If you had let her die, I should have died. My God, what peril she was in! In saving her, you saved me. So you are welcome here, as a son. For the first time since my Jeanne was a babe, Fort o' God offers itself to a man who is a stranger, and its hospitality is yours so long as its walls hang together. And as they have done this for upward of 200 years, Monsieur Philip, we may conclude that our friendship is to be without end." He clasped Philip's hands again, and 2 tears coursed down his gray cheeks. It was difficult for Philip to restrain the joy his words produced, which, coming from the lips of Jeanne's father, lifted him suddenly into a paradise of hope. For many reasons he had come to expect a none too warm reception at Fort o' God. He had looked ahead to the place with a grim sort of fear, scarcely definable. And here Jeanne's father was opening his arms to him. Pierre was unapproachable. Jeanne herself was a mystery, filling him alternately with hope and despair. D'Arcambal had accepted him as a son. He could find no words adequate to his emotion, none that could describe his own happiness, unless it was in a bold avowal of his love for the girl he had saved. And this his good sense told him not to make at the present moment. "Any man would have done as much for your daughter," he said at last, "and I am happy that I was the fortunate one to render her assistance." "You are wrong," said D'Arcambal, taking him by the arm. "You are one out of 1,000. It takes a man to go through the big thunder and come out at the other end alive. I know of only one other who has done that in the last 20 years, and that other is Henry d'Arcambal himself. We 3, you, Jeanne, and I, have alone triumphed over those monsters of death. All others have died. It seems like a strange pointing of the hand of God." Philip trembled. "We 3?" he exclaimed. "We 3," said the old man, "and for that reason you are a part of Fort o' God." He led Philip deeper into the great room, and Philip saw that almost all the space along the walls of the huge room was occupied by shelves upon shelves of books, masses of papers, piles of magazines shoulder high, scores of maps and paintings. The massive table was covered with books. There were piles on smaller tables, chairs and the floor itself covered with the skins of a score of wild beasts were littered with them. At the far end of the room he saw deeper and darker shelves, where gleamed faintly in the lamplight row upon row of vials and bottles and strange instruments of steel and glass. A scientist in the wilderness, a student exiled in a desolation. These were the thoughts that leaped into his mind, and he knew that in this room Jeanne had been created, that here, between these centuries-old walls, amid an environment of strange silence, of whispering age, her visions of the world had come. Here, separated from all her kind, God, nature, and a father had made her of their handiwork. The old man pointed Philip to a chair near the large table, and sat down close to him. At his feet was a stool covered with silvery lynx skin, and D'Arcambal looked at this, his strong, grim face relaxing into a gentle smile of happiness. "This is where Jeanne sits, at my feet," he said. "It has been her place for many years. When she is not there I am lost. Life ceases. This room has been our world. Tonight you are in Fort o' God. Tomorrow you will see D'Arcambal House. You have heard of that, perhaps, but never of Fort o' God. That belongs to Jeanne and me, to Pierre, and you. Fort o' God is the heart, the soul, the life's blood of D'Arcambal House. It is this room and 2 or 3 others. D'Arcambal House is our barrier. When strangers come, they see D'Arcambal House. Plain rooms of rough wood, quarters such as you have seen at posts and stations, the mask which gives no hint of what is hidden within. It is there that we live to the world. It is here that we live to ourselves. Jeanne has my permission to tell you whatever she wishes, a little later. But I am curious, and being an old man must be humored first. I am still trembling. You must tell me what happened to Jeanne." For an hour they talked, and Philip went over one by one the events as they had occurred since the fight on the cliff, omitting only such things as he thought that Jeanne and Pierre might wish to keep secret to themselves. At the end of that hour he was certain that D'Arcambal was unaware of the dark cloud that had suddenly come into Jeanne's life. The old man's brow was knitted with deep lines, and his powerful jaws were set hard as Philip told of the ambush, of the wounding of Pierre, and the flight of his assailants with his daughter. It was to get money, the old man thought. The half-breed had suggested that, and Jeanne herself had given it as her opinion. Why else should they have been attacked at Churchill? Such things had occurred before, he told Philip. The little daughter of the factor at Nelson House had been stolen and held for ransom. With 100 questions he wrung from Philip every detail of the second fight and of the struggle for life in the rapids. He betrayed no physical excitement even in those moments of Philip's description when Jeanne hung between life and death, but in his eyes there was the glow of red-hot fires. At last there came to interrupt them the low, musical tinkling of a bell under the table. D'Arcambal's face lighted up suddenly. "Ah, I had forgotten!" he exclaimed. "Pardon me, Philip. Dinner has been awaiting us this last half-hour, and besides—" he reached out and touched a tiny button, which Philip had not observed before. "I am selfish." He had hardly ceased speaking when footsteps sounded in the hall, and in spite of every resolution he had made to guard himself against any betrayal of the emotions burning in his breast, Philip sprang to his feet. Jeanne had come in under the glow of the lamps and stood now a dozen feet from him, a vision so exquisitely lovely that he saw nothing of those who entered behind her, nor heard D'Arcambal's low, happy laugh at his side. It seemed to him for a moment as if there had suddenly appeared before him the face of the picture that was turned against the wall, only more beautiful now, radiant with the glow of living flesh and blood. But there was something even more startling than this resemblance. In this moment Jeanne was the fulfillment of his dream. She had come to him from out of another world. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown of pure white, a fabric so delicate that it seemed to float about her slender form, responsive to every breath she drew. Her white shoulders revealed themselves above masses of filmy lace that fell upon her bosom. Her slender arms, girlish rather than womanly in their beauty, were bare. Her hair was bound up in shining coils about her head, with a single flower nestling amid a little cluster of curls that fell upon her neck. After his first movement, Philip recovered himself by a strong effort. He bowed low to conceal the flush in his face. Jeanne swept him a little curtsy, and then ran past him, with the eagerness of any modern child, into the outstretched arms of her father. Laughter and joy rumbled in the beard of the master of Fort o' God as he looked over Jeanne's head at Philip. "And this is what you have saved for me," he said. Then he looked beyond, and for the first time Philip realized there were others in the room. One was Pierre, the other a pretty, dark-faced girl, with hair that glistened like a raven's wing in the lamp-glow. Jeanne left her father's arms and gave her hand to Philip. "M'sieur Philip, this is my sister, Mademoiselle Couchee," she cried. Pierre's sister gave Philip her hand, and behind them D'Arcambal laughed softly in his beard again, and said, "To-morrow, in D'Arcambal House, you may call her Otille, Philip. But to-night we are in Fort o' God." "Oh, Jeanne, Jeanne, what a witch you are!" "An angel," breathed Philip, but no one heard him. "And this witch," added the old man, "you are to take into supper, M'sieur Philip. To-night I suppose that I must call you Monsieur, but to-morrow, when I have on my leather leggings and my skin cap, I will call you Phil, or Tom, Dick, or Harry, just as I please. This is the first time, sir, that my Jeanne has ever gone in to dinner on another arm than mine or Pierre's. And so I may be a little jealous. Proceed." As Jeanne's hand rested in his arm, and they went into the hall, Philip could not restrain himself from whispering, "I am glad of that." "And the dress, M'sieur Philip!" exclaimed D'Arcambal behind them, in the voice of a happy boy. "It is an honor to escort that, to say nothing of the silly girl that's in it. That dress, sir, belonged to a beautiful lady who was called Camille, and who died over a century ago." "Father, please do be good," protested Jeanne. "Remember—" "Ah, so I will," said her father. "I had forgotten that you were to tell M'sieur Philip these things." They entered another room illuminated by a single huge lamp suspended above a table spread with silver and fine linen. The room was as great a surprise as the other two had been. It contained no chairs. What Philip mentally designated as benches, with deep cushioned seats of greenish leather, were arranged about the table. These same curious seats furnished other parts of the room. From the pictures on the walls to the ancient helmet and cuirass that stood up like a legless sentinel in one corner, this room, like the others, breathed of extreme age. Over a big open fireplace, in which half a dozen birch logs were burning, hung a number of old-fashioned weapons, a flintlock, a pair of obsolete French dueling pistols, a short rapier similar to that which Pierre wore, and two long swords. Philip noticed that about each of the dueling pistols was tied a bow of ribbon, dull and faded, as though the passing of generations had robbed them of beauty and color, to be replaced by the somberness of age. During the meal Philip could but observe that Jeanne was laboring under some mysterious strain. Her cheeks were brilliantly flushed, and her eyes were filled with a lustrous brightness that he had never seen in them before. Their beauty was almost feverish. Several times he caught a strange little tremor of her white shoulders, as though a sudden chill had passed through her. He discovered, too, that Pierre was observing these things, and that there was something forced in the half-breed's cheerfulness. But D'Arcambal and Otille seemed completely oblivious of any change. Their happiness overflowed. Philip thought of his last supper at Churchill, with Eileen Brokaw and her father. Miss Brokaw had acted strangely then, and had struggled to hide some secret grief or excitement, as Jeanne was struggling now. He was glad when the meal was finished, and the master of Fort o' God rose from his seat. At D'Arcambal's movement his eyes caught Jeanne's, and then he saw that Pierre was looking sharply at him. "Jeanne owes you an apology and an explanation, M'sieur Philip," said D'Arcambal, resting a hand upon Jeanne's head. "We are going to retire, and she will initiate you into the fold of Fort o' God." Pierre and Otille followed him from the room. For the first time in an hour Jeanne laughed frankly at Philip. "There isn't much to explain, M'sieur Philip," she said, rising from her seat. "You know pretty nearly all there is to know about Fort o' God now. Only I am sure that I did not appear to value your confidence very much, a little while ago. It must have seemed ungrateful in me, indeed, to have told you so little about myself and my home, after what you did for Pierre and me. But I have Father's permission now. It is the second time that he has ever given it to me." "And I don't want to hear," exclaimed Philip, bluntly. "I have been more or less of a brute, Miss Jeanne. I know enough about Fort o' God. It is a glorious place. You owe me nothing, and for that reason—" "But I insist," interrupted the girl. "Do you mean to say that you do not care to listen, when this is the second time in my life that I have had the opportunity of talking about my home? And the first didn't give me any pleasure. This will." A shadow came into Jeanne's eyes. She motioned him to a seat beside her in front of the fire. Her nearness, the touch of her dress, the sweet perfume of her presence thrilled him. He felt that the moment was near when the whole world as he knew it was to slip away from him, leaving him in a paradise or a chaos of despair. Jeanne looked up at the dueling pistols. The firelight trembled in the soft folds of lace over her bosom. It glistened in her hair, and lighted her face with a gentle glow. "There isn't much to explain," she said again, in a voice so low that it was hardly more than a whisper. "But what little there is I want you to know, so that when you go away you will understand. More than 200 years ago a band of gentlemen adventurers were sent over into this country by Prince Rupert to form the Hudson's Bay Company. That is history, and you know more of it probably than I. One of these men was Le Chevalier Grosellier. One summer he came up the Churchill, and stopped at the great rock on which we saw the sun setting tonight, and which was called the Sun Rock by the Indians. He was struck by the beauty of the place, and when he went back to France it was with the plan of returning to build himself a chateau in the wilderness. 2 or 3 years later he did this, and called the place Fort o' God. For more than a century, monsieur, Fort o' God was a place of revel and pleasure in the heart of this desolation. Early in the 19th century it passed into the hands of a man by the name of D'Arcy, and it is said that at one time it housed 20 gentlemen and as many ladies of France for one whole season. Its history is obscure and mostly lost. But for a long time after D'Arcy came, it was a place of adventure, of pleasure, and of mystery, very little of which remains today. Those are his pistols above the fire. He was killed by one of them out there beside the big rock, in a quarrel with one of his guests over a woman. We think, here, from letters that we have found, that her name was Camille. There is a chest in my room filled with linen that bears her name. This dress came from that chest. I have to be careful of them, as they tear very easily. After D'Arcy the place was almost forgotten and remained so until nearly 40 years ago, when my father came into possession of it. That, monsieur, is the very simple history of Fort o' God. Its old name is forgotten. It lives only with us. Others know it as D'Arcambal House. Yes, I have heard of that, said Philip. He waited for Jeanne, and saw that her fingers were nervously twisting a bit of ribbon in her lap. Of course that is uninteresting, she continued. You can almost guess the rest. We have lived here alone. Not one of us has ever felt the desire to leave this little world of ours. It is curious, you may scarcely believe what I say, but it is true that we look out upon your big world and laugh at it and dislike it. I guess that I have been taught to hate it, since I can remember. There was a little tremble in Jeanne's voice, an instant's quivering of her chin. Philip looked from her face into the fire, and stared hard, choking back words which were ready to burst from his lips. In place of them he said, with a touch of bitterness in his voice, "And I have grown to hate my world, Jeanne. It has compelled me to hate it. That is why I spoke to you that night on the cliff at Churchill." "I have sometimes thought that I have been very wrong," said the girl. "I have never seen this other world. I know nothing of it, except as I have been taught. I have no right to hate it, and yet I do. I have never wanted to see it. I have never cared to know the people who lived in it. I wish that I could understand, but I cannot, except that Father has made for us, for Pierre and Otille and me, this little world at Fort o' God, and has taught us to fear the other. I know that there is no other man in the whole world like my father, and that what he has done must be best. It is his pride that we bring your world to our doors, but that we never go to it. He says that we know more about that world than the people who live there, which of course cannot be so. And so we have grown up amid the old memories, the pictures, and the dead romances of Fort o' God. We have taken pleasure in living as we do, in making for ourselves our own little social codes, our childish aristocracy, our make-believe world. It is the spirit of Fort o' God that lives with us, and makes us content. The shadow, faces of men and women who once filled these rooms with life and pleasure, and whose memory seems to have passed into our keeping alone. I know them all, many of their names, all of their faces. I have a daguerreotype of Camille Poitiers, and she must have been very beautiful. There are the tiniest slippers in the world in her chest, and ribbons like those which are tied about the pistols. There is a painting of D'Arcy in your room. It is the picture next to the one that has its face turned to the wall." She rose to her feet, and Philip stood beside her. There was a mist in her eyes as she held out her hand to him. I would like to have you see that picture," she whispered. Philip could not speak. He held the hand Jeanne had given him as they passed through the long, dimly lighted halls. At the open door to his room they stopped, and he could feel Jeanne trembling. "You will tell me the truth?" she begged, like a child. "You will tell me what you think of the picture?" "Yes." She went in ahead of him, and turned the frame so that the face of the picture smiled down upon them in all of its luring loveliness. There was something pathetic in the girl's attitude now. She stood under the picture, facing Philip, and there was a tense eagerness in her eyes, a light that was almost supplication, a crying out of her soul to him in a breathless moment that seemed hovering between pain and joy. It was Jeanne, an older Jeanne, that looked from out of the picture, smiling, inviting admiration, bewildering in her beauty. It was Jeanne, the child, waiting for him in flesh and blood to speak, her eyes big and dark, her breath coming quickly, her hands buried in the deep lace on her bosom. A low word came to Philip's lips, and then he laughed softly. It was a laugh, almost under his breath, which sweeps up now and then from a soul in a joy, an emotion which is unutterable in words. But to Jeanne it was different. Her dark eyes grew hurt and wounded. Two great tears ran down her paling cheeks, and suddenly she buried her face in her hands and with a sobbing cry turned from him, with her head bowed under the smiling face above. "And you hate it, too," she sobbed. "They all hate it. Pierre, father, all hate it. It must be bad. They hate her, every one, but me. And I love her so." Her slender form shook with sobs. For a moment Philip stood like one struck dumb. Then he sprang to her and caught her close in his arms. "Jeanne, listen," he cried. "To-night I looked at that picture before I went to see your father, and I loved it because it is like you. Jeanne, my darling, I love you. I love you." She was panting against his breast. He covered her face with kisses. Her sweet lips were not turned from him, and there filled her eyes a sudden light that made him almost sob in his happiness. "I love you. I love you," he repeated again and again, and he could find no other words than those. For an instant her arms clung about his shoulders, and then, suddenly, they strained against him, and she tore herself free, and with a cry so pathetic that it seemed as though her heart had broken in that moment, she fled from him and out of the room. End of chapter 17. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 18 of Flower of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Flower of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 18. Philip stood where Jeanne had left him, his arms half reaching out to the vacant door through which she had fled, his lips parted as if to call her name, and yet motionless, dumb. A moment before he was intoxicated by a joy that was almost madness. He had held Jeanne in his arms. He had looked into her eyes, filled with surrender under his caresses and his avowal of love. For a moment he had possessed her, and now he was alone. The cry that had wrung itself from her lips, breaking in upon his happiness like a blow, still rang in his ears, and there was something in the exquisite pain of it that left him in torment. Heart and soul, every drop of blood in him, had leaped in the joy of that glorious moment when Jeanne's eyes and sweet lips had accepted his love, and her arms had clung about his shoulders. Now these things had been struck dead within him. He felt again the fierce pressure of Jeanne's arms as she had thrust him away. He saw the fright and torture that had leaped into her eyes as she sprang from him, as though his touch had suddenly become a sacrilege. He lowered his arms slowly, and went to the hall. It was empty. He heard no sound, and closed the door. It was so still that he could hear the excited throbbing of his own heart. He looked at the picture again, and a strange fancy impressed him with the idea that it was no longer smiling at him, but that its eyes were turned to the door through which Jeanne had disappeared. He moved his position, and the illusion was gone. It was Jeanne looking down upon him again, an older and happier Jeanne than the one whom he loved. For the first time he examined it closely. In one corner of the canvas he found the artist's name, Bourret, and after it the date, 1888. Could it be the picture of Jeanne's mother? He told himself that it was impossible, for Jeanne's mother had been found dead in the snow, 5 years later than the date of the canvas, and Pierre, the half-breed, had buried her somewhere out in the barren, so that she was a mystery to all but him. Even the master of Fort o' God, to whom he had brought the child, had never seen the woman upon whose cold breast Pierre had found the little Jeanne. With nervous hands he replaced the picture with its face to the wall, and began to pace up and down the room, wondering if D'Arcambal would send for him. He had hope of seeing Jeanne again that night. He felt sure that she had gone to her room, and that even D'Arcambal might not know that he was alone. In that event he had a long night ahead of him, filled with hours of sleeplessness and torment. He waited for 3/4 of an hour, and then the idea came to him that he might discover some plausible excuse for seeking out his host. He was about to act upon this mental suggestion when he heard a low rustling in the hall, followed by a distinct and yet timid knock. It was not a man's knock, and filled with the hope that Jeanne had returned, Philip hastened to the door and opened it. He heard soft footsteps retreating rapidly down the hall, but the lights were out, and he could see nothing. Something had fallen at his feet, and he bent down to pick it up. The object was a small square envelope, and re-entering his room he saw his own name written across it in Jeanne's delicate hand. His heart beat with hope as he opened the note. What he read brought a gray pallor into his face. Monsieur Philip, if you cannot forget what I have done, please at least try to forgive me. No woman in the world could value your love more than I, for circumstances have proven to me the strength and honor of the man who gives it. And yet it is as impossible for me to accept it as it would be for me to give up Fort o' God, my father, or my life, though I cannot tell you why. And this I know you will not ask. After what has happened tonight, it will be impossible for me to see you again, and I must ask you, as one who values your friendship among the highest things in my life, to leave Fort o' God. No one must know what has passed between us. You will go in the morning, and with you there will always be my prayers. Jeanne. The paper dropped from between Philip's fingers and fell to the floor. 3 or 4 times in his life Philip had received blows that had made him sick, physical blows. He felt now as though one of these blows had descended upon him, turning things black before his eyes. He staggered to the big chair and dropped into it, staring at the bit of white paper on the floor. If one had spoken to him, he would not have heard. Gregson, in these moments, might have laughed a little nervously, smoked innumerable cigarettes, and laid plans for a continuance of the battle tomorrow. But Philip was a fighter of men, and not of women. He had declared his love, he had laid open his soul to Jeanne, and to a heart like his own, simple in its language, boundless in its sincerity, this was all that could be done. Jeanne's refusal of his love was the end, for him. He accepted his fate without argument. In an instant he would have fought 10 men, 100, naked-handed, if such a fight would have given him a chance of winning Jeanne. He would have died, laughing, happy, if it had been in a struggle for her. But Jeanne herself had dealt him the blow. For a long time he sat motionless in the chair facing the picture on the wall. Then he rose to his feet, picked up the note, and went to one of the little square windows that looked out into the night. The moon had risen and the sky was full of stars. He knew that he was looking into the north, for the pale shimmer of the aurora was in his face. He saw the black edge of the spruce forest, the barren stretched out, pale and ghostly, into the night shadows. He made an effort to open the window, but it was wedged tightly in its heavy sill. He crossed the room, opened the door, and went silently down the hall to the door through which Pierre had led him a few hours before. It was not locked, and he passed out into the night. The fresh air was like a tonic, and he walked swiftly out into the moonlit spaces until he found himself in the deep shadow of the Sun Rock that towered like a sentinel giant above his head. He made his way around its huge base, and then stopped, close to where they had landed in the canoe. There was another canoe drawn up beside Pierre's, and two figures stood out clear in the moonlight. One of these was a man, the other a woman, and as Philip stopped, wondering at the scene, the man advanced to the woman and caught her in his embrace. He heard a voice, low and expostulating, which sounded like Otille's, and in spite of his own misery Philip smiled at this other love which had found its way to Fort o' God. He turned back softly, leaving the lovers as he had found them. But he had scarce taken half a dozen steps when he heard other steps, and saw that the girl had left her companion and was hurrying toward him. He drew back close into the shadow of the rock to avoid possible discovery, and the girl passed through the moonlight almost within arm's reach of him. At that moment his heart ceased to beat. He choked back the groaning cry that rose to his lips. It was not Otille who passed him. It was Jeanne. In another moment she was gone. The man had shoved his canoe into the narrow stream, and was already lost in the gloom. Then, and not until then, did the cry of torture fall from Philip, and as if in echo to it he heard the sobbing break of another voice, and stepping out into the moonlight he stood face to face with Pierre Couchee. It was Pierre who spoke first. "I am sorry, monsieur," he whispered hoarsely. "I know that it has broken your heart. And mine, too, is crushed." Something in the half-breed's face, in the choking utterance of his voice, struck Philip as new and strange. He had seen the eyes of dying animals filled with the wild pain that glowed in Pierre's, and suddenly he reached out and gripped the other's hand, and they stood staring into each other's face. In that look, the cold grip of their hands, the strife in their eyes, the bare truth revealed itself. "And you, too. You love her, Pierre," said Philip. "Yes, I love her, monsieur," replied Pierre softly. "I love her, not as a brother, but as a man whose heart is broken." "Now I understand," said Philip. He dropped Pierre's hand, and his voice was cold and lifeless. "I received a note from her asking me to leave Fort o' God in the morning," he went on, looking from Pierre out beyond the rock into the white barren. "I will go tonight." "It is best," said Pierre. "I have left nothing in Fort o' God, so there is no need of even returning to my room," continued Philip. "Jeanne will understand, but you must tell her father that a messenger came suddenly from Blind Indian Lake, and that I thought it best to leave without awakening him. Will you guide me for a part of the distance, Pierre?" "I will go with you the whole way, monsieur. It is only 20 miles, 10 by canoe, 10 by land." They said no more, but both went to the canoe, and were quickly lost in the gloom into which the other canoe had disappeared a few minutes ahead of them. They saw nothing of this canoe, and when they came to the Churchill, Pierre headed the birch bark downstream. For 2 hours not a word passed between them. At the end of that time the half-breed turned in to shore. "We take the trail here, monsieur," he explained. He went on ahead, walking swiftly, and now and then when Philip caught a glimpse of his face he saw in it a despair as great as his own. The trail led along the backbone of a huge ridge, and then twisted down into a broad plain. And across this they traveled, one after the other, two moving, silent shadows in a desolation that seemed without end. Beyond the plain there rose another ridge, and half an hour after they had struck the top of it Pierre halted, and pointed off into the ghostly world of light and shadow that lay at their feet. "Your camp is on the other side of this plain, monsieur," he said. "Do you recognize the country?" "I have hunted along this ridge," replied Philip. "It is only 3 miles from here, and I will strike a beaten trail half a mile out yonder. 1,000 thanks, Pierre." He held out his hand. "Good by, monsieur." "Good by, Pierre." Their voices trembled. Their hands gripped hard. A choking lump rose in Philip's throat, and Pierre turned away. He disappeared slowly in the gray gloom, and Philip went down the side of the mountain. From the plain below he looked back. For an instant he saw Pierre, drawn like a silhouette against the sky. "Good by, Pierre!" he shouted. "Good by, monsieur," came back faintly. Light and silence dropped about them. End of chapter 18. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 19 of Flower of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Flower of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 19. To be alone, even after the painful parting with Pierre, was in one way a relief to Philip, for with the disappearance of the lonely half-breed over the mountain there had gone from him the last physical association that bound him to Jeanne and her people. With Pierre at his side, Jeanne was still with him, but now that Pierre was gone there came a change in him, one of those unaccountable transmutations of the mind which make the passing of yesterdays more like a short dream than a long and full reality. He walked slowly over the plain, and when he came to the trail beaten by the hoofs of his own teams he followed it mechanically. In his measurement of things now, it seemed only a few hours since he had traveled over this trail on his way to Fort Churchill. It might have been that morning, or the morning before. The weeks of his absence had passed with marvelous swiftness, now that he looked back upon them. They seemed short and trivial. And yet he knew that in those weeks he had lived more of his life than he had ever lived before, or would ever live again. For a brief spell life had been filled with joy and hope, a promise of happiness, which a single moment in the shadow of the Sun Rock had destroyed forever. He had seen Jeanne in another man's arms. He had read the confirmation of his fears in Pierre's grief-distorted face, in the strange tremble of his voice, in the words that he had spoken. He was sorry for Pierre. He would have been glad if that other man had been the lovable half-breed, if Jeanne, in the poetry of life and love, had given herself to the one who had saved the spark of life in her chilled little body years and years ago. And yet in his own grief he unconsciously rejoiced that it was a man like Pierre who suffered with him. This thought of Pierre strengthened him, and he walked faster, and breathed more deeply of the clear night air. He had lost in the fight for Jeanne as he had lost in many other fights. But, after all, there was another and bigger fight ahead of him, which he would begin tomorrow. Thoughts of his men, of his camps, and of this struggle through which he must pass to achieve success raised him above his depression and stirred his blood with a growing exhilaration. And Jeanne, was she hopelessly lost to him? He dared to ask himself the question half an hour after he had separated from Pierre, and his mind flew back to the portrait room where he had told Jeanne of his love, and where for a moment he had seen in her eyes and face the sweet surrender that had given him a glimpse of his paradise. But what did the sudden change mean? And after that, the scene in the starlight? A quickening of his pulse was the answer to these questions. Jeanne had told him there were only two men at Fort o' God, Pierre and her father. Then who could be this third? A lover whom she met clandestinely? He shivered, and began loading his pipe as he walked. He was certain that the master of Fort o' God did not know of the tryst beyond the rock, and he was equally certain that the girl was unaware of Pierre's knowledge of the meeting. Pierre had remained hidden, like himself, and he had given Philip to understand that it was not the first time he had looked upon the meetings of Jeanne and the man they had seen from the shadow of the rock. And yet, in spite of all evidence, he could not lose faith in Jeanne. Suddenly he saw something ahead of him which changed for a moment the uncomfortable trend of his thoughts. It was a pale streak, rising above the level of the trail, and stretching diagonally across the plain to the east. With an exclamation of surprise Philip hastened his steps, and a moment later stood among the fresh workings of his men. When he had left for Churchill this streak, which was the last stretch of road bed between them and the surveyed line in the Hudson's Bay Railway, had ended 2 miles to the south and west. In a little over a month MacDougall had pushed it on the trail and well across it in the direction of Gray Beaver Lake. In that time he had accomplished a work which Philip had not thought possible to achieve that autumn. He had figured that the heavy snows of winter would cut them off at the trail, and MacDougall was beyond the trail, with 3 weeks to spare. Something rose up in his blood, warming him with an elation which sent him walking swiftly toward the end of the road bed. A quarter of a mile out on the plain he came to the working end. About him were scattered half a dozen big scoop shovels and piles of working tools. The embers of a huge log fire still glowed where dinner had been cooked for the men. Philip stood for a few moments, looking off into the distance. Another mile and a half out there was the Gray Beaver, and from the Gray Beaver there lay the unbroken waterway to the point of their conjunction with the railway coming up from the south. A sudden idea occurred to Philip. If MacDougall had built 2 1/4 miles of road bed in 5 weeks, they could surely complete this other mile and a half before winter stopped them. In that event they would have 15 miles of road, linking 7 lakes, which would give them a splendid winter trail for men, teams, and dogs to the Gray Beaver. And from the Gray Beaver they would have smooth ice for 20 miles, to the new road. He had not planned to begin fishing operations until spring, but he could see no reason now why they should not commence that winter, setting their nets through the ice. At Lobstick Creek, where the new road would reach them sometime in April or May, they could freeze their fish and keep them in storage. 500 tons in stock, and perhaps 1,000, would not be a bad beginning. It would mean from $40,000 to $80,000, a half of which could be paid out in dividends. He turned back, whistling softly. There was new life in him, burning for action. He was eager to see MacDougall, and he hoped the Brokaw would not be long in reaching Blind Indian Lake. Before he reached the trail, he was planning the accommodation stations, where men and animals could find shelter. There would be one on the shore of the Gray Beaver, and from there he would build them at regular intervals of 5 miles on the ice. He had come to the trail, and was about to turn in the direction of the camp, when he saw a shadowy figure making its way slowly across the plain which he had traversed half an hour before. The manner in which this person was following in his footsteps, apparently with extreme caution, caused Philip to move quickly behind the embankment of the road-bed. 2 or 3 minutes later a man crossed into view. Philip could not see his face distinctly, but by the tired droop of the stranger's shoulders and his shuffling walk he guessed that what he had first taken for caution was in reality the tedious progress of a man nearing exhaustion. He wondered how he had missed him in his own journey over the trail from the Ridge Mountains, for he had made twice the progress of the stranger, and must surely have passed him somewhere within the last mile or so. The fact that the man had come from the direction of Fort o' God, that he was exhausted, and that he had evidently concealed himself a little way back to avoid discovery, led Philip to cut out diagonally across the plain so that he could follow him and keep him in sight without being observed. Twice in the next mile the nocturnal traveler stopped to rest. But no sooner had he reached the first scattered shacks of the camp than he quickened his steps, darting quickly among the shadows, and then stopped at last before the door of a small log cabin within a pistol-shot of Philip's own headquarters. The cabin was newly built, and Philip gave a low whistle of surprise as he noted its location. He had, to a certain degree, isolated his own camp home, building it a couple of 100 yards back from the shore of the lake, where most of the other cabins were erected. This new cabin was still 100 yards farther back, half hidden in a growth of spruce. He heard the click of a key in a lock and the opening and closing of a door. A moment later a light flared dimly against a curtained window. Philip hurried across the open to the cabin occupied by himself and MacDougall, the engineer. He tried the door, but it was barred. Then he knocked loudly, and continued knocking until a light appeared within. He heard the Scotchman's voice, close to the door. "Who's there?" it demanded. "None of your business," retorted Philip, falling into the error of a joke at the welcome sound of MacDougall's voice. "Open up!" A bar slipped within. The door opened slowly. Philip thrust himself against it and entered. In the pale light of the lamp he was confronted by the red face of MacDougall, and a pair of little eyes that gleamed menacingly. And on a line with MacDougall's face was an ugly-looking revolver. Philip stopped with a sudden uncomfortable thrill. MacDougall lowered his gun. "Lord preserve us, but that's the time you almost drew a perforation!" he exclaimed. "It isn't safe to cut up in these diggings any more. Not with Sandy MacDougall." He held out a hand with a relieved laugh, and the two men shook in a grip that made their fingers ache. "Is this the way you welcome all of your friends, Mac?" MacDougall shrugged his shoulders and laid his gun on a table in the center of the room. "Can't say that I've got a friend left in camp," he said, with a curious grimace. "What in thunder do you mean, Phil? I've tried to reason something out of it, but I can't." Philip was hanging up his cap and coat on one of a number of wooden pegs driven into the long wall. He turned quickly. "Reason something out of what?" he said. "Your instructions from Churchill," replied MacDougall, picking up a big, black-bowled pipe from the table. Philip sat down with a restful sigh, crossed his legs, loaded his pipe, and lighted it. "Thought I made myself lucid enough, even for a Scotchman, Sandy," he said. "I learned at Churchill that the big fight is going to be pulled off mighty soon. It's about time for the fireworks. So I told you to put the sub-camps in fighting shape, and arm every responsible man in this camp. There's going to be a whole lot of gun work before you're many days older. Great Scott, man, don't you understand now? What's the matter?" MacDougall was staring at him as if struck dumb. "You told me to arm the camps?" he gasped. "Yes. I sent you full instructions 2 weeks ago." MacDougall tapped his forehead suspiciously with a stubby forefinger. "You're mad, or trying to pull off a poor brand of joke," he exclaimed. "If you're dreaming, come out of it. Look here, Phil," he cried, a little heatedly. "I've been having a hell of a time since you left the camp, and I want to talk seriously." It was Philip who stared now. He fairly thrust himself upon the engineer. "Do you mean to say you didn't get my letter telling you to put the camps in fighting shape?" "No, I didn't get it," said MacDougall. "But I got the other." "There was no other." MacDougall jumped to his feet, darted to his bunk, and came back a moment later with a letter. He thrust it almost fiercely into Philip's hands. A sweat broke out upon his face as he saw its effect upon his companion. Philip's face was deadly pale when he looked up from the letter. "My God! You haven't done this?" he gasped. "What else could I do?" demanded MacDougall. "It's down there in black and white, isn't it? It charges me to outfit 6 prospecting parties of 10 men each, arm every man with a rifle and revolver, victual them for 2 months, and send them to the points named there. That letter came 10 days ago, and the last party, under Tom Billinger, has been gone a week. You told me to send your very best men, and I have. It has fairly stripped the camp of the men we depended upon, and there are hardly enough guns left to kill meat with." "I didn't write this letter," said Philip, looking hard at MacDougall. "The signature is a fraud. The letter which I sent to you, revealing my discoveries at Churchill, has been intercepted and replaced by this. Do you know what it means?" MacDougall was speechless. His square jaw was set like an iron clamp, his heavy hands doubled into knots on his knees. "It means fight," continued Philip. "Tonight, tomorrow, at any moment now. I can't guess why the blow hasn't fallen before this." He quickly related to MacDougall the chief facts he had gathered at Fort Churchill. When he had finished, the young Scotchman reached over to the table, seized his revolver, and held the butt end of it out to Philip. "Pump me full of lead. For God's sake, do, Phil," he pleaded. Philip laughed and gripped his hand. "Not while I need a few fighters like yourself, Sandy," he objected. "We're on to the game in time. By tomorrow morning we'll be prepared for the war. We haven't an hour, perhaps not a minute, to lose. How many men can you get hold of tonight whom we can depend upon to fight?" 10 or a dozen, no more. The road gang that we were expecting up from the Grand Trunk Pacific came 3 days after you started for Churchill, 28 of 'em. They're a tough-looking outfit, but devilish good workers. I believe you could hire that gang to do anything. They won't take a word from me. It's all up to Thorpe, the foreman who brought 'em up, and they won't obey an order unless it comes through him. Thorpe could get them to fight, but they haven't anything to fight with, except a few knives. I've got 8 guns left, and I can scrape up 8 men who'll handle them for the glory of it. Thorpe's gang would be mighty handy in close quarters, if it came to that." MacDougall moved restlessly, and ran a hand through his tawny hair. "I almost wish we hadn't invited that bunch up here," he added. "They look to me like a lot of dollar thugs, but they work like horses. Never saw such men with the shovel and pick. And fight? They've cleaned up on a half of the men in camp. If we can get Thorpe—" "We'll see him tonight," interrupted Philip. "Or, to be correct, this morning. It's 1 o'clock. How long will it take to round up our best men?" "Half an hour," said MacDougall promptly, jumping to his feet. "There are Roberts, Henshaw, Tom Cassidy, Lecault, the Frenchman, and the 2 St. Pierre brothers. They're all crack gunmen. Give 'em each an automatic, and they're worth 20 ordinary men." A few moments later MacDougall extinguished the light, and the 2 men left the cabin. Philip drew his companion's attention to the dimly lighted window of the cabin to which he had followed the stranger a short time before. "That's Thorpe's," said the young engineer. "I haven't seen him since morning. Guess he must be up." "We'll sound him first," said Philip, starting off. At MacDougall's knock there was a moment's silence inside, then heavy footsteps, and the door was flung open. Sandy entered, followed by Philip. Thorpe stepped back. He was of medium height, yet so athletically built that he gave the impression of being 2 inches taller than he actually was. He was smooth-shaven, and his hair and eyes were black. His whole appearance was that of a person infinitely superior to what Philip had expected to find in the gang foreman. His first words, and the manner in which they were spoken, added to this impression. "Good evening, gentlemen." "Good morning," replied MacDougall, nodding toward Philip. "This is Mr. Whittemore, Thorpe. We saw your light and thought you wouldn't mind a call." Philip and Thorpe shook hands. "Just in time to have a cup of coffee," invited Thorpe pleasantly, motioning toward a steaming pot on the stove. "I just got in from a long hike out over the new road bed. Been looking the ground over along the north shore of the Gray Beaver, and was so interested that I didn't start for home until dark. Won't you draw up, gentlemen? There are mighty few who can beat me at making coffee." MacDougall had noted a sudden change in Philip's face, and as Thorpe hastened to lift the overboiling pot from the stove, he saw his chief make a quick movement toward a small table and pick up an object which looked like a bit of cloth. In an instant Philip had hidden it in the palm of his hand. A flush leaped into his cheeks. A strange fire burned in his eyes when Thorpe turned. "I'm afraid we can't accept your hospitality," he said. "I'm tired and want to get to bed. In passing, however, I couldn't refrain from dropping in to compliment you on the remarkable work your men are doing out on the plain. It's splendid." "They're good men," said Thorpe quietly. "Pretty wild, but good workers." He followed them to the door. Outside, Philip's voice trembled when he spoke to MacDougall. "You go for the others and bring them to the office, Sandy," he said. "I said nothing to Thorpe because I have no confidence in liars, and Thorpe is a liar. He was not out to the Gray Beaver today, for I saw him when he came in, from the opposite direction. He is a liar, and he will bear watching. Mind that, Sandy. Keep your eyes on this man Thorpe. And keep your eyes on his gang. Hustle the others over to the office as soon as you can." They separated, and Philip returned to the cabin which they had left a few minutes before. He relighted the lamp, and with a sharp gasp in his breath held out before his eyes the object which he had taken from Thorpe's table. He knew now why Thorpe had come over from the mountains that night, why he was exhausted, and why he had lied. He clasped his head between his hands, scarcely believing the evidence of his eyes. A deeper breath, almost a moan, fell from his twisted lips, for he had discovered that Thorpe, the gang foreman, was Jeanne's lover. In his hand he held the dainty handkerchief, embroidered in blue, which he had seen in Jeanne's possession earlier that evening, crumpled and discolored, still damp with her tears. End of chapter 19. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 20 of Flower of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Flower of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 20. For many minutes Philip did not move, or look from the bit of damp fabric which he held between his fingers. His heart was chilled. He felt sick. Each moment added to the emotion which was growing in him, an emotion which was a composite of disgust and of anguish. Jeanne! Thorpe! An eternity of difference seemed to lie between those two. Jeanne, with her tender beauty, her sweet life, her idyllic dreams, and Thorpe, the gang driver. In his own soul he had made a shrine for Jeanne, and from his knees he had looked up at her, filled with the knowledge of his own unworthiness. He had worshipped her as Dante might have worshipped Beatrice. To him she was the culmination of all that was sweet and lovable in woman, transcendently above him. And from this love, this worship of his, she had gone that very night to Thorpe, the gangman. He shivered. Going to the stove he thrust in a handful of paper, dropped the handkerchief in with it, and set the whole on fire. A few moments later the door opened and MacDougall came in. He was followed by the two swarthy-faced St. Pierres, the camp huntsmen. Philip shook hands with them, and they passed after the engineer through a narrow door leading into a room which was known as the camp office. Cassidy, Henshaw, and the others followed within the next 10 minutes. There was not a man among them whose eyes faltered when Philip put up his proposition to them. As briefly as possible he told them a part of what he had previously revealed to MacDougall, and frankly conceded that the preservation of property and life in the camp depended almost entirely upon them. "You're not the sort of men to demand pay in a pinch like this," he finished. "And that's just the reason I've confidence enough in you to ask for your support. There are 50 men in camp who we could hire to fight, but I don't want hired fighters. I don't want men who will run at the crack of a few rifles, but men who are willing to die with their boots on. I won't offer you money for this, because I know you too well. But from this hour on, you're going to be a part of the Great Northern Fish and Development Company, and as soon as the certificates can be signed, I'm going to turn over 100 shares of stock to each of you. Remember that this isn't pay. It's simply a selfish scheme of mine to make you a part of the company. There are 8 of us. Give us each an automatic, and I'll wager that there isn't a combination in this neck of the woods strong enough to do us up." In the pale light of the 2 oil lamps the men's faces glowed with enthusiasm. Cassidy was the first to grip Philip's hand in a pledge of fealty. "When hell freezes over, we're licked," he said. "Where's me automatic?" MacDougall brought in the guns and ammunition. "In the morning we will begin the erection of a new building close to this one," said Philip. "There is no reason for the building, but that will give me an excuse for keeping you men together on one job, within 50 feet of your guns, which we can keep in this room. Only 4 men need work at a shift, and I'll put Cassidy in charge of the operations, if that is satisfactory to the others. We'll have a couple of new bunks put in here so that 4 men can stay with MacDougall and me every night. The other 4, who are not on the working shift, can hunt not far from the camp, and keep their eyes peeled. Does that look good?" "Can't be beat," said Henshaw, throwing open the breech of his gun. "Shall we load?" "Yes." The room became ominous with the metallic click of loaded cartridge clips and the hard snap of released chambers. 5 minutes later Philip stood alone with MacDougall. The loaded rifles, each with a filled cartridge belt hanging over the muzzle, were arranged in a row along one of the walls. "I'll stake everything I've got on those men," he exclaimed. "Mac, did it ever strike you that when you want real men you ought to come north for them? Every one of those fellows is a Northerner, except Cassidy, and he's a fighter by birth. They'll die before they go back on their word." MacDougall rubbed his hands and laughed softly. "What next, Phil?" "We must send the swiftest man you've got in camp after Billinger, and get word to the other parties you sent out as quickly as we can. They'll probably get in too late. Billinger may arrive in time." "He's been gone a week. It's doubtful if we can get him back within 3," said MacDougall. "I'll send St. Pierre's cousin, that young Crow Feather, after him as soon as he can get a pack ready. You'd better go to bed, Phil. You look like a dead man." Philip was not sure that he could sleep, notwithstanding the physical strain he had been under during the past 24 hours. He was filled with a nervous desire for continued action. Only action kept him from thinking of Jeanne and Thorpe. After MacDougall had gone to stir up young Crow Feather, he undressed and stretched out in his bunk, hoping that the Scotchman would soon return. Not until he closed his eyes did he realize how tired he was. MacDougall came in an hour later, and Philip was asleep. It was 9 o'clock when he awoke. He went to the cook's shanty, ate a hot breakfast of griddle cakes and bacon, drank a pint of strong coffee, and hunted up MacDougall. Sandy was just coming from Thorpe's house. "He's a queer guinea, that Thorpe," said the engineer, after their first greeting. "He doesn't pretend to do a pound's work. Notice his hands when you see him again, Phil. They look as though he'd been drumming a piano all his life. But love a'mighty, how he does make the others work! You want to go over and see his gang throw dirt." "That's where I'm going," said Philip. "Is Thorpe at home?" "Just leaving. There he is now." At MacDougall's whistle Thorpe turned and waited for Philip. "Going over?" he asked pleasantly, when Philip came up. "Yes, I want to see how your men work without a leader," replied Philip. He paused for a moment to light his pipe, and pointed to a group of men down on the lake shore. "See that gang?" he asked. "They're building a scow. Take away their foreman, and they wouldn't be worth their grub. They're men we brought up from Winnipeg." Thorpe was rolling a cigarette. Under his arm he held a pair of light gloves. "Mine are different," he laughed quietly. "I know that," rejoined Philip, watching the skill of his long white fingers. "That's why I want to see them in action, when you're away." "My policy is to know to a cubic foot what a certain number of men are capable of doing in a certain time," explained Thorpe, as they walked toward the plane. "My next move is to secure the men who will achieve the result, whether I am present or not. That done, my work is done. Simple, isn't it?" There was something likable about Thorpe. Even in his present mood Philip could not but concede that. He was surprised in Thorpe, in more ways than one. His voice was low, and filled with a certain companionable quality that gave one confidence in him immediately. He was apparently a man of education and of some little culture, in spite of his vocation, which usually possesses a vocabulary of its own as hard as rock. But Philip's greatest surprise came when he regarded Thorpe's personal appearance. He judged that he was past 40, perhaps 45, and the thought made him shudder inwardly. He was twice, almost 3 times as old as Jeanne. And yet there was about him something irresistibly attractive, a fascination which had its influence upon Philip himself. His nails dug into the flesh of his hands when he thought of this man and Jeanne. Thorpe's gang was hard at work when they came to the end of the rock bed. Scarcely a man seemed to take notice when he appeared. There was one exception, a wiry, red-faced little man who raised a hand to his cap when he saw the foreman. "That's the sub-foreman," explained Thorpe. "He answers to me." The little man had given a signal, and Thorpe added, "Excuse me for a moment. He's got something on his mind." He drew a few steps aside, and Philip walked along the line of laboring men. He grinned and nodded to them, one after another. MacDougall was right. They were the toughest lot of men he had ever seen in one gang. Loud voices turned him about, and he saw that Thorpe and the sub-foreman had approached a huge, heavy-shouldered man with whom they seemed to be in serious altercation. 2 or 3 of the workmen had drawn near, and Thorpe's voice rang out clear and vibrant. "You'll do that, Blake, or you'll shoulder your kit back home. And what goes with you goes with your clique. I know your kind, and you can't worry me. Take that pick and dig, or hike. There's no 2 ways about it." Philip could not hear what the big man said, but suddenly Thorpe's fist shot out and struck him fairly on the jaw. In another instant Thorpe had jumped back and was facing 6 angry, threatening men. He had drawn a revolver, and his white teeth gleamed in a cool and menacing smile. "Think it over, boys," he said quietly. "And if you're not satisfied, come in and draw your pay this noon. We'll furnish you with outfits and plenty of grub if you don't like the work up here. I don't care to hold men like you on your contracts." He came to meet Philip as though nothing unusual had happened. "That will delay the completion of our work for a week at least," he said, as he thrust his revolver into a holster hidden under his coat. "I've been expecting trouble with Blake and 4 or 5 of his pals for some time. I'm glad it's over. Blake threatens a strike unless I give him a sub-foremanship and increase the men's wages from $6 to $10 a day. Think of it! A strike! Up here! It would be the beginning of history, wouldn't it?" He laughed softly, and Philip laughed from sheer admiration of the man's courage. "You think they'll go?" he asked anxiously. "I'm sure of it," replied Thorpe. "It's the best thing that can happen." An hour later Philip was back in camp. He did not see Thorpe again until after dinner, and then the gang foreman hunted him up. His face wore a worried look. "It's a little worse than I expected," he said. "Blake and 8 others came in for their pay and outfits this noon. I didn't think that more than 3 or 4 would have the nerve to quit." "I'll furnish you with men to take their places," said Philip. "There's the hitch," replied Thorpe, rolling a cigarette. "I want my men to work by themselves. Put 6 of your amateur roadmen among them, and it'll mean 20% less work done, and perhaps trouble. They're a tough lot. I concede that. I've thought of a way to offset the loss of Blake and the others. We can set a gang of your men at work over at Gray Beaver Lake, and they can build up to meet us." Philip saw MacDougall soon after his short talk with Thorpe. The engineer did not disguise his pleasure at the turn which affairs had taken. "I'm glad they're going," he declared. "If there's to be trouble, I'll feel easier with that bunch out of camp. I'd give my next month's salary if Thorpe would take his whole outfit back where they came from. They're doing business with the roadbed all right, but I don't like the idea of having 'em around when there are throats to be cut, one side or t'other." Philip did not see Thorpe again that day. He selected his men for the Gray Beaver work, and in the afternoon dispatched a messenger over the Fort Churchill route to meet Brokaw. He was confident that Brokaw and his daughter would show up during the next few days, but at the same time he instructed the messenger to go to Churchill if he should not meet them on the way. Other men he sent to recall the prospecting parties outfitted by MacDougall. Early in the evening the St. Pierres, Lecault, and Henshaw joined him for a few minutes in the office. During the day the four had done scout work 5 miles on all sides of the camp. Lecault had shot a moose 3 miles to the south, and had hung up the meat. One of the St. Pierres saw Blake and his gang on the way to the Churchill. Beyond these 2 incidents they brought in no news. A little later MacDougall brought in 2 other men whom he could trust, and armed them with muzzle loaders. They were the 2 last guns in the camp. With 10 men constantly prepared for attack, Philip began to feel that he had the situation well in hand. It would be practically impossible for his enemies to surprise the camp, and after their first day's scout duty the men on the trail would always be within sound of rifle shots, even if they did not discover the advance of an attacking force in time to beat them to camp. In the event of one making such a discovery, he was to signal the others by a series of shots, such as one might fire at a running moose. Philip found it almost impossible to fight back his thoughts of Jeanne. During the 2 or 3 days that followed the departure of Blake he did not allow himself an hour's rest from early dawn until late at night. Each night he went to bed exhausted, with the hope that sleep would bury his grief. The struggle wore upon him, and the faithful MacDougall began to note the change in his comrade's face. The 4th day Thorpe disappeared, and did not show up again until the following morning. Every hour of his absence was like the stab of a knife in Philip's heart, for he knew that the gang foreman had gone to see Jeanne. 3 days later the visit was repeated, and that night MacDougall found Philip in a fever. "You're overdoing," he told him. "You're not in bed 5 hours out of the 24. Cut it out, or you'll be in the hospital instead of in the fighting line when the big show comes to town." Days of mental agony and of physical pain followed. Neither Philip nor MacDougall could understand the mysterious lack of developments. They had expected attack before this, and yet ceaseless scout work brought in no evidence of an approaching crisis. Neither could they understand the growing disaffection among Thorpe's men. The numerical strength of the gang dwindled from 19 down to 15, from 15 to 12. At last Thorpe voluntarily asked Philip to cut his salary in 2, because he could not hold his men. On that same day the little sub-foreman and 2 others left him, leaving only 9 men at work. The delay in Brokaw's arrival was another puzzle to Philip. 2 weeks passed, and in that time Thorpe left camp 3 times. On the 15th day the Fort Churchill messenger returned. He was astounded when he found that Brokaw was not in camp, and brought amazing news. Brokaw and his daughter had departed from Fort Churchill 2 days after Pierre had followed Jeanne and Philip. They had gone in 2 canoes up the Churchill. He had seen no signs of them anywhere along the route. No sooner had he received the news than Philip sent the messenger after MacDougall. The Scotchman's red face stared at him blankly when he told him what had happened. "That's their first move in the real fight," said Philip, with a hard ring in his voice. "They've got Brokaw. Keep your men close from this hour on, Sandy. Hereafter let 5 of them sleep in our bunks during the day, and keep them awake during the night." 5 days passed without a sign of an enemy. About 8 o'clock on the night of the 6th, MacDougall came into the office where Philip was alone. The young Scotchman's usually florid face was white. He dropped a curse as he grasped the hand of a chair with both hands. It was the 3rd or 4th time that Philip had heard MacDougall swear. "Damn that Thorpe!" he cried in a low voice. "What's up?" asked Philip, his muscles tightening. MacDougall viciously beat the ash from the bowl of his pipe. "I didn't want to worry you about Thorpe, so I've kept quiet about some things," he growled. Thorpe brought up a load of whiskey with him. I knew it was against the law you've set down for this camp, but I figured you were having trouble enough without getting you into a mix-up with him, so I didn't say anything. But this other is damnable. Twice he's had a woman sneak in to visit him. She's there again tonight." A choking, gripping sensation rose in Philip's throat. MacDougall was not looking, and did not see the convulsive twitching of the other's face, or the terrible light that shot for an instant into his eyes. "A woman! Mac!" "A young woman," said MacDougall with emphasis. "I don't know who she is, but I do know that she hasn't a right there, or she wouldn't sneak in like a thief. I'm going to be blunt, damned blunt. I think she's one of the other men's wives. There are half a dozen in camp. Haven't you ever looked to see if you could recognize her?" "Haven't had the chance," said MacDougall. "She's been wrapped up both times, and as it was none of my business, I didn't lay in wait. But now it's up to you." Philip rose slowly. He felt cold. He put on his coat and cap, and buckled on his revolver. His face was deadly white when he turned to MacDougall. "She is over there tonight?" "Sneaked in not half an hour ago. I saw her come out of the edge of the spruce." "From the trail that leads out over the plain?" "Yes." Philip walked to the door. "I'm going over to call on Thorpe," he said quietly. "I may not be back for some time, Sandy." In the deep shadows outside he stood gazing at the light in Thorpe's cabin. Then he walked slowly toward the spruce. He did not go to the door, but leaned with his back against the building, near one of the windows. The first shuddering sickness had gone from him. His temples throbbed. At the sound of a voice inside which was Thorpe's, the chill in his blood turned to fire. The terrible fear that had fallen upon him at MacDougall's words held him motionless, and his brain worked upon but one idea, one determination. If it was Jeanne who came in this way, he would kill Thorpe. If it was another woman, he would give Thorpe that night to get out of the country. He waited. He heard the gangman's voice frequently, once in a loud, half-mocking laugh. Twice he heard a lower voice, a woman's. For an hour he watched. He walked back and forth in the gloom of the spruce, and waited another hour. Then the light went out, and he slipped back to the corner of the cabin. After a moment the door opened, and a hooded figure came out, and walked rapidly toward the trail that buried itself amid the spruce. Philip ran around the cabin and followed. There was a little open beyond the first fringe of spruce, and in this he ran up silently from behind and overtook the one he was pursuing. As his hand fell upon her arm, the woman turned upon him with a frightened cry. Philip's hand dropped. He took a step back. "My God! Jeanne! It is you!" His voice was husky, like a choking man's. For an instant Jeanne's white, terrified face met his own. And then, without a word to him, she fled swiftly down the trail. Philip made no effort to follow. For 2 or 3 minutes he stood like a man turned suddenly into hewn rock, staring with unseeing eyes into the gloom where Jeanne had disappeared. Then he walked back to the edge of the spruce. There he drew his revolver and cocked it. The starlight revealed a madness in his face as he approached Thorpe's cabin. He was smiling, but it was such a smile as presages death, a smile as implacable as fate itself. End of chapter 20. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 21 of Flower of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Flower of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 21. As Philip approached the cabin, he saw a figure stealing away through the gloom. His first thought was that he had returned a minute too late to wreak his vengeance upon the gang foreman in his own home, and he quickened his steps in pursuit. The man ahead of him was cutting direct for the camp supply house, which was the nightly rendezvous of those who wished to play cards or exchange camp gossip. The supply house, aglow with light, was not more than 200 yards from Thorpe's, and Philip saw that if he dealt out the justice he contemplated, he had not a moment to lose. He began to run, so quickly that he approached within a dozen paces of the man he was pursuing without being heard. It was not until then that he made a discovery which stopped him. The man ahead was not Thorpe. Suddenly, looking beyond him, he saw a second figure pass slowly through the lighted door of the supply house. Even at that distance he recognized the gang foreman. He thrust his revolver under his coat, and fell a little farther behind the man he had mistaken for Thorpe, so that when the latter passed within the small circle of light that came from the supply house windows, he was 50 instead of a dozen paces away. Something in the other's manner, something strangely and potently familiar in his slim, lithe form, in the quick, half-running movement of his body, drew a sharp breath from Philip. He was on the point of calling a name, but it died on his lips. A moment more and the man passed through the door. Philip was certain that it was Pierre Couchee who had followed Thorpe. He was filled with a sudden fear as he ran toward the store. He had scarcely crossed the threshold when a glance showed him Thorpe leaning upon a narrow counter, and Pierre close beside him. He saw that the half-breed was speaking, and Thorpe drew himself erect. Then, as quick as a flash, two things happened. Thorpe's hand went to his belt. Pierre's sent a lightning gleam of steel back over his shoulder. The terrible drive of the knife and the explosion of Thorpe's revolver came in the same instant. Thorpe crumpled back over the counter, clutching at his breast. Pierre turned about, staggering, and saw Philip. His eyes lighted up, and with a moaning cry he stretched out his arms as Philip sprang to him. Above the sudden tumult of men's feet and excited voices he gasped out Jeanne's name. Half a dozen men had crowded about them. Through the ring burst MacDougall, a revolver in his hand. Pierre had become a dead weight in Philip's arms. "Help me over to the cabin with him, Mac," he said. He looked around among the men. It struck him as curious, even then, that he saw none of Thorpe's gang. "Is Thorpe done for?" he asked. "He's dead," replied someone. With an effort Pierre opened his eyes. "Dead," he breathed, and in that one word there was a tremble of joy and triumph. "Take Thorpe over to his cabin," commanded Philip, as he and MacDougall lifted Pierre between them. "I will answer for this man." They could hear Pierre's sobbing breath as they hurried across the open. They laid him on Philip's bunk, and Pierre opened his eyes again. He looked at Philip. "Monsieur," he whispered, "tell me, quick, if I must die." MacDougall had studied medicine and surgery before engineering, and took the place of camp physician. Philip drew back while he ripped open the half-breed's garments and bared his breast. Then he darted to his bunk for the satchel in which he kept his bandages and medicines, throwing off his coat as he went. Philip bent over Pierre. Blood was oozing slowly from the wounded man's right breast. Over his heart Philip noticed a blood-stained locket, fastened by a babiche string about his neck. Pierre's hands groped eagerly for Philip's.
"Monsieur, you will tell me if I must die," he pleaded. "There are things you must know about Jeanne if I go. It will not hurt. I am not afraid. You will tell me?"
"Yes," said Philip. He could scarcely speak, and while MacDougall was at work stood so that Pierre could not see his face. There was a sobbing note in Pierre's breath, and he knew what it meant. He had heard that same sound more than once when he had shot moose and caribou through the lungs. 5 minutes later MacDougall straightened himself. He had done all that he could. Philip followed him to the back part of the room. Almost without sound his lips framed the words, "Will he die?" "Yes," said MacDougall. "There is no hope. He may last until morning." Philip took a stool and sat down beside Pierre. There was no fear in the wounded man's face. His eyes were clear. His voice was a little stronger.
"I will die, Monsieur?" he said calmly.
"I am afraid so, Pierre." Pierre's damp fingers closed about his own. His eyes shone softly, and he smiled.
"It is best," he said, "and I am glad. I feel quite well. I will live for some time?"
"Perhaps for a few hours, Pierre."
"God is good to me,"
breathed Pierre devoutly.
"I thank him. Are we alone?"
"Do you wish to be alone?"
"Yes."
Philip motioned to MacDougall, who went into the little office room.
"I will die,"
whispered Pierre softly, as though he were achieving a triumph.
"And everything would die with me, Monsieur, if I did not know that you love Jeanne, and that you will care for her when I am gone. Monsieur, I have told you that I love her. I have worshipped her next to my God. I die happy, knowing that I am dying for her. If I had lived I would have suffered, for I love alone. She does not dream that my love is different from hers, for I have never told her. It would have given her pain. And you will never let her know. As our dear lady is my witness, Monsieur, she has loved but one man, and that man is you."
Pierre gave a great breath. A warm flood seemed suddenly to engulf Philip. Did he hear right? Could he believe? He fell upon his knees beside Pierre and brushed his dark hair back from his face. "Yes, I love her," he said softly. "But I did not know that she loved me."
"It is not strange," said Pierre, looking straight into his eyes. "But you will understand now, Monsieur. I seem to have strength, and I will tell you all, from the beginning. Perhaps I have done wrong. You will know soon. You remember Jeanne told you the story of the baby, of the woman frozen in the snow? That was the beginning of the long fight for me. This, what I am about to tell you, will be sacred to you, Monsieur?"
"As my life," said Philip. Pierre was silent for a few moments. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, so that he could tell in few words the tragedy of years. 2 brilliant spots burned in his cheeks, and the hand which Philip held was hot.
"Years ago, 20 almost,
there came a man to Fort o' God," he began.
"He was very young and from the south.
D'Arcambal was then middle-aged, but his wife was young and beautiful. Jeanne says that you saw her picture, against the wall. D'Arcambal worshipped her. She was his life. You understand what happened. The man from the south, the young wife, they went away together." Pierre coughed. A bit of blood reddened his lips. Philip wiped it away gently with his handkerchief, hiding the stain from Pierre's eyes. "Yes," he said. "I understand." "It broke D'Arcambal's heart," resumed Pierre. "He destroyed everything that had belonged to the woman. He turned her picture to the wall. His love turned slowly to hate. It was 2 years later that I came over the barrens one night and found Jeanne and her dead mother. The woman, monsieur, Jeanne's mother, was D'Arcambal's wife. She was returning to Fort o' God, and God's justice overtook her almost at its doors. I carried little Jeanne to my Indian mother, and then made ready to carry the woman to her husband. It was then that a terrible thought came to me. Jeanne was not D'Arcambal's daughter. She was a part of the man who had stolen his wife. I worshipped the little Jeanne even then, and for her sake my mother and I swore secrecy and buried the woman. Then we took the babe to Fort o' God as a stranger. We saved her. We saved D'Arcambal. No one ever knew." Pierre stopped for breath. "Was it best?" "It was glorious," said Philip, trembling. "It would have come out right, in the end, if the father had not returned," said Pierre. "I must hurry, monsieur, for it hurts me now to talk. He came first a year ago, and revealed himself to Jeanne. He told her everything. D'Arcambal was rich. Jeanne and I both had money. He threatened. We bought him off. We fought to keep the terrible thing from D'Arcambal. Our money sent him away for a time. Then he returned. It was news of him I brought up the river to Jeanne, from Churchill. I offered to kill him, but Jeanne would not listen to that. But the great God willed that I should. I killed him tonight, over there." A great joy surged above the grief in Philip's heart. He could not speak, but pressed Pierre's hand harder, and looked into his glistening eyes. Pierre's next words broke his silence, and wrung a low cry from his lips. "Monsieur, this man Thorpe, Jeanne's father, is the man whom you know as Lord Fitzhugh Lee." He coughed violently, and with sudden fear Philip lifted his head so that it rested against his shoulder. After a moment he lowered it again. His face was as white as Pierre's after that sudden fit of coughing. "I talked with him, alone, on the afternoon of the fight on the rock," continued Pierre huskily. "He was hiding in the woods near Churchill, and left for Fort o' God on that same day. I did not tell Jeanne until after what happened, and I came up with you on the river. Thorpe was waiting for us at Fort o' God. It was he whom Jeanne saw that night beside the rock, but I could not tell you the truth then. He came often after that, 2, 3 times a week. He tortured Jeanne. My God, he taunted her, monsieur, and made her let him kiss her, because he was her father. We gave him money, all that we could get. We promised him more if he would leave. $5,000 in 3 years. He agreed to go, after he had finished his work here. And that work, monsieur, was to destroy you. He told Jeanne because it made her fear him more. He compelled her to come to his cabin. He thought she was his slave, that she would do anything to be free of him. He told her of his plot, how he had fooled you in the sham fight with one of his men, how those men were going to attack you a little later, and how he had intercepted your letter from Churchill
and sent in its place the other letter which made your camp defenseless. He was not afraid of her. She was in his power, and he laughed at her horror, and tortured her as a cat will a bird. But Jeanne—" A spasm of pain shot over Pierre's face. Fresh blood dyed his lips, and a shiver ran through his body. "My God! Water! Something, monsieur!" he gasped. "I must go on." Philip raised him again in his arms. He saw MacDougall's head appear through the door. "You will rest easier this way, Pierre," he said. After a few moments Pierre spoke in a gasping whisper. "You must understand. I must be quick," he said. "We could not warn you of what Jeanne had discovered. That would have revealed her father. D'Arcambal would have known, every one. Thorpe plans to dress his men like Indians. They are to attack your camp tomorrow night. 10 days ago we went to the camp of old Sachigo, the Cree, who loves Jeanne as his own daughter. It was Jeanne's idea to save you. Jeanne told him of Thorpe's plot to destroy you, and to lay the blame on Sachigo's people. Sachigo is out there, in the mountains, hiding, with 30 of his tribe. 2 days ago Jeanne learned where her father's men were hiding. We had planned everything. Tomorrow night, when they moved to attack, we were to start a signal fire on the big rock mountain at the end of the lake. Sachigo starts at the signal and lays in ambush for the others in the ravine between the 2 mountains. None of Thorpe's men will come out alive. Sachigo and his people will destroy them, and none will ever know how it happened, for the Crees keep their secrets. But now it is too late for me. When it happens, I will be gone. The signal pile is built, birch bark, at the very top of the rock. Jeanne will wait for me out on the plain, and I will not come. You must fire the signal, monsieur, as soon as it is dark. None will ever know. Jeanne's father is dead. You will keep the secret of her mother, always." "Forever," said Philip. MacDougall came into the room. He brought a glass partly filled with a colored liquid, and placed it to Pierre's lips. Pierre swallowed with an effort, and with a significant hunch of his shoulders for Philip's eyes alone, the engineer returned to the little room. "Mon Dieu, how it burns!" said Pierre, as if to himself. "May I lie down again, monsieur?" Philip lowered him gently. He made no effort to speak in these moments. Pierre's eyes were dark and luminous as they sought his own. The draught he had taken gave him a passing strength. "I saw Thorpe again this afternoon," he said, more calmly. "D'Arcambal thought I had taken Jeanne to visit a trapper's wife down the Churchill. I saw Thorpe alone. He had been drinking. He laughed at me and said that Jeanne and I were fools, that he would not leave as he had said he would, but that he would remain, always. I told Jeanne and asked her again to let me kill him, but she said no, and I had taken my oath to her. Jeanne saw him again tonight. I was near the cabin and saw you. I told him I would kill him if he did not go. He laughed again and struck me. When I came to my feet he was half across the open. I followed. I forgot my oath. Rage filled my heart. You know what happened. You will tell Jeanne so that she will understand?" "Can we not send for her?" asked Philip. "She must be near." "No, monsieur," he replied softly. It would only give her great pain to see me like this. She was to meet me tonight at 12 o'clock, on the trail where the roadbed crosses. You will meet her in my place. When she understands all that has happened, you may bring her here, if she wishes to come. Then, tomorrow night, you will go together to fire the signal."
"But Thorpe is dead," said Philip. "Will they attack without him?"
"There is another, besides him," said Pierre. "That is one secret which Thorpe has kept from Jeanne, who the other is. The one who is paying to have you destroyed. Yes, they will attack."
Philip bent low over Pierre. "I have known of this plot for a long time, Pierre," he said tensely. "I know that this Thorpe, who for some reason has passed as Lord Fitzhugh Lee, is but the agent of a more powerful force behind him. Have you told me all, Pierre? Do you know nothing more?"
"Nothing, monsieur."
"Was it Thorpe who attacked you on the cliff at Churchill?"
"No, I am sure that it was not he. If the attack had not failed, it would have meant loss for him. I have laid it to the ruffians who wanted to kill me, and secure Jeanne. You understand?"
"Yes, but I do not believe that was the motive for the attack, Pierre," said Philip. "Did Thorpe go to see any one in Churchill?"
"I don't know. He was concealing himself in the forest."
A convulsive shudder ran through Pierre's body. He gave a low cry of pain, and his hand clutched at the babiche cord which held the locket about his neck.
"Monsieur," he whispered quickly, "this locket was on the little Jeanne when I found her in the snow. I kept it because it bears the woman's initials. I am foolish, monsieur. I am weak. But I would like to have it buried with me, under the old tree, where Jeanne's mother lies. And if you could, monsieur, if you only could, place something of Jeanne's in my hand, I would rest easier."
Philip bowed his head in silence, while his eyes grew blinding hot. Pierre pressed his hand.
"She loves you, as I love her," he whispered, so low that Philip could scarcely hear. "You will love her, always. If you do not, the great God will let the curse of Pierre Couchee fall upon you."
Choking back the great sobs that rose in his breast, Philip sank upon his knees beside Pierre, and buried his face in his arms like a heartbroken boy. For several moments there was a silence, punctuated by the rasping breath of the wounded man. Suddenly this sound ceased, and Philip felt a cold fear leap through him. He listened, neither breathing nor lifting his head. In that interval of pulseless quiet a terrible cry came from Pierre's lips, and when Pierre looked up the dying half-breed had struggled to a sitting posture, blood staining his lips again, his eyes blazing, his white face damp with the clammy touch of death, and was staring through the cabin window. It was the window that looked out over the lake, toward the rock mountain half a mile away. Philip turned, horrified and wondering. Through the window he saw a glow in the sky, the glow of a fire leaping up in a crimson flood from the top of the mountain. Again that terrible moaning cry fell from Pierre's lips, and he reached out his arms toward the signal that was blazing forth its warning in the night.
"Jeanne, Jeanne," he sobbed. "My Jeanne."
He swayed and fell back. His words came in choking gasps.
"The signal!"
he struggled, fighting to make Philip understand him.
Jeanne saw Thorpe tonight. He must changed plans. Attack tonight. Jeanne. My Jeanne has lighted the signal fire.
A tremor ran through his body, and he lay still. MacDougall ran across from the half-open door and put his head to Pierre's breast.
Is he dead?
Asked Philip. Not yet.
Will he become conscious again?
Possibly. Philip gripped MacDougall by the arm.
The attack is to be made tonight, Mac, he exclaimed. Warn the men. Have them ready. But you, MacDougall, attend to this man, and keep him alive.
Without another word he ran to the door and out into the night. The signal fire was leaping to the sky. It lighted up the black cap of the mountain and sent 1,000 aurora fires flashing across the lake. And Philip, as he ran swiftly through the camp toward the narrow trail that led to the mountain top, repeated over and over again the dying words of Pierre.
Jeanne, my Jeanne, my Jeanne.
End of chapter 21. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 22 of Flower of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Flower of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 22. News of the double tragedy had swept through the camp, and there was a crowd in front of the supply house. Philip passed close to Thorpe's house to avoid discovery, ran 100 yards up the trail over which Jeanne had fled a short time before, and then cut straight across through the thin timber for the head of the lake. He felt no effort in his running. Low bush whipped him in the face and left no sting. He was not conscious that he was panting for breath when he came out in the black shadow of the mountain. This night in itself had been a creation for him, for out of grief and pain it had lifted him into a new life, and into a happiness that seemed to fill him with the strength and the endurance of 5 men. Jeanne loved him. The wonderful truth cried itself out in his soul at every step he took, and he murmured it aloud to himself over and over again as he ran. The glow of the signal fire lighted up the sky above him, and he climbed up, higher and higher, scrambling swiftly from rock to rock, until he saw the tips of the flames licking up into the sky. He had come up the steepest and shortest side of the ridge, and when he reached the top he lay upon his face for a moment, his breath almost gone. The fire was built against a huge dead pine, and the pine was blazing 100 feet in the air. He could feel its heat. The monster torch illumined the barren cap of the rock from edge to edge, and he looked about him for Jeanne. For a moment he did not see her, and her name rose to his lips, to be stilled in the same breath by what he saw beyond the burning pine. Through the blaze of the heat and fire he beheld Jeanne, standing close to the edge of the mountain, gazing into the south and west. He called her name. Jeanne turned toward him with a startled cry, and Philip was at her side. The girl's face was white and strained. Her lips were twisted in pain at sight of him. She spoke no word, but a strange sound rose in her throat, a welling up of the sudden despair which the firelight revealed in her eyes. For one moment they stood apart, and Philip tried to speak. And then suddenly he reached out and drew her quickly into his arms, so quickly that there was no time for her to escape, so closely that her sweet face lay imprisoned upon his breast, as he had held it once before under the picture at Fort o' God. He felt her straining to free herself. He saw the fear in her eyes, and he tried to speak calmly, while his heart throbbed with the passion of love which he wished to pour into her ears. "Listen, Jeanne," he said. "Pierre has sent me to you. He has told me everything, everything, my sweetheart. There is nothing to keep from me now. I know. I understand. And I love you, love you, love you, my own sweet Jeanne." She trembled at his words. He felt her shuddering in his arms, and her eyes gazed at him wonderingly, filled with a strange and incredulous look, while her lips quivered and remained speechless. He drew her nearer until his face was against her own, and the warmth of her lips, her eyes, and her hair entered into him, and near stifled his heart with joy. "He has told me everything, my little Jeanne," he said again, in a whisper that rose just above the crackling of the pine. "Everything. He told me because he knew that I loved you, and because—" The words choked in his throat. At this hesitation Jeanne drew her head back, and with her hands pressing against his breast, looked into his face. There were in her eyes the same struggling emotions, but with them now there came also a sweet faltering, a piteous appeal to him, a faith that rose above her terrors, and the tremble of her lips was like that of a crying child. He drew her face back, and kissed the quivering lips, and suddenly he felt the strain against him give way, and Jeanne's head sobbed upon his breast. In that moment, looking where the roaring pine sent its pinnacles of flames leaping up into the night, a word of thanks, of prayer, rose mutely to his lips, and he held Jeanne more closely, and whispered over and over again in his happiness, "Jeanne, Jeanne, my sweetheart, Jeanne!" Jeanne's sobs grew less and less, and Philip strengthened himself to tell her the terrible news of Pierre. He knew that in the selfishness of his own joy he had already wasted precious minutes, and very gently he took Jeanne's wet face between his two hands and turned it a little toward his own. "Pierre has told me everything, Jeanne," he repeated. "Everything, from the day he found you many years ago to the day your father returned to torture you." He spoke calmly, even as he felt her shiver in pain against him. "Tonight there was a little trouble down in the camp, dear. Pierre is wounded and wants you to come to him. Thorpe is dead." For an instant Philip was frightened at what happened. Jeanne's breath ceased. There seemed to be not a quiver of life in her body, and she lay in his arms as if dead. And then suddenly there came from her a terrible cry, and she wrenched herself free, and stood a step from him, her face as white as death. "He is dead?" "Yes, he is dead." "And Pierre killed him?" Philip held out his arms, but Jeanne did not seem to see them. She saw the answer in his face. "And Pierre is hurt?" she went on, never taking her wide, luminous eyes from his face. Before he answered, Philip took her trembling hands in his own, as though he would lighten the blow by the warmth and touch of his great love. "Yes, he is hurt, Jeanne," he said. "We must hurry, for I am afraid there is no time to lose." "He is dying?" "I fear so, Jeanne." He turned before the look that came into her face, and led her about the circle of fire to the side of the mountain that sloped down into the plain. Suddenly Jeanne stopped for an instant. Her fingers tightened about his. Her face was turned back into the endless desolation of night and forest that lay to the south and west. Far out, a mile, 2 miles, an answering fire was breaking the black curtain that hid all things beyond them. Jeanne lifted her face to him. Grief and love, pain and joy, shone in her eyes. "They are there," she said chokingly. It is Sachigo, and they are coming, coming, coming!" Once again before they began the descent of the mountain, Philip drew her close in his arms and kissed her. And this time there was the sweet surrender to him of all things in the tenderness of Jeanne's lips. Silent in their grief, and yet communing in sympathy and love in the firm clasp of their hands, they came down the mountain, through the thin spruce forest, and to the lighted cabin where Pierre lay dying. MacDougall was in the room when they entered, and rose softly, tiptoeing into the little office. Philip led Jeanne to Pierre's side, and as he bent over him and spoke softly, the half-breed opened his eyes. He saw Jeanne. Into his fading eyes there came a wonderful light. His lips moved, and his hands strove to lift themselves above the crumpled blanket. Jeanne dropped upon her knees beside him, and as she clasped his chilled hands to her breast, a glorious understanding lighted up her face, and then she took Pierre's face between her hands and bowed her own close down to it, so that the two were hidden under the beauteous halo of her hair. Philip gripped at his throat to hold back a sob. A terrible stillness came into the room, and he dared not move. It seemed a long time before Jeanne lifted her head, slowly, tenderly, as if fearing to awaken a sleeping child. She turned to him, and he read the truth in her face before she had spoken. Her voice was low and calm, filled with the sweetness and tenderness and strength that come only to a woman in the final moment of a great sorrow. "Leave us, Philip," she said. "Pierre is dead." End of chapter 22. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 23 of Flower of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Flower of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 23. For a moment Philip bowed his head, and then he turned and went noiselessly from the room, without speaking. As he closed the door softly behind him, he looked back, and from her attitude beside Pierre he knew that Jeanne was whispering a prayer. A vision flashed before him, so quick that it had come like a ray of light, a vision of another hour, years and years ago, when Pierre had knelt beside her, and when he had lifted up his wild, half-thought prayer out in the death-chill of the snowy barrens. And this was his reward, to have Jeanne kneel beside him as the soul which had loved her so faithfully took its flight. Philip could not see when he turned his face to the light of the office. For the first time the grief which he had choked back escaped in a gasping break in his voice, and he wiped his eyes with his pocket-handkerchief. He knew that MacDougall was looking upon his weakness, but he did not at first see that there was another person in the room besides the engineer. This second person rose to meet him, while MacDougall remained in his seat, and as he came out into the clearer light of the room, Philip could scarce believe his eyes. It was Gregson. "I am sorry that I came in just at this time, Phil," he greeted in a low voice. Philip stared, still incredulous. He had never seen Gregson as he looked now. The artist advanced no farther. He did not hold out his hand. There was none of the joy of meeting in his face. His eyes shifted to the door that led into the death chamber, and they were filled with the gloom of a condemned man. With a low word Philip held out his hand to meet his old comrade's. Gregson drew back. "No, not now," he said. "Wait until you have heard me." Something in his cold, passionless voice stopped Philip. He saw Gregson glance toward MacDougall, and understood what he meant. Going to the engineer, He placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke so that only he could hear. "She is in there, Mac, with Pierre. She wanted to be alone with him for a few minutes. Will you wait for her outside at the door and take her over to Cassidy's wife? Tell her that I will come to her in a little while." He followed MacDougall to the door, speaking to him in a low voice, and then turned to Gregson. The artist had seated himself at one side of the small office table, and Philip sat down opposite him, holding out his hand to him again. "What is the matter, Greggy?" "This is not a time for long explanations," said the artist, still holding back his hand. "They can come later, Phil. But tonight, now, you must understand why I cannot shake hands with you. We have been friends for a good many years. In a few minutes we will be enemies, or you will be mine. One thing, before I go on, I must ask of you. I demand it. Whatever passes between us during the next 10 minutes, say no word against Eileen Brokaw. I will say what you might say, that for a time her soul wandered and was almost lost. But it has come back to her, strong and pure. I love her. Some strange fate has ordained that she should love me, worthless as I am. She is to be my wife." Philip's hand was still across the table. "Greggy! Greggy! God bless you!" he cried softly. "I know what it is to love and to be loved. Why should I be your enemy because Eileen Brokaw's heart has turned to gold, and she has given it to you? Greggy, shake!" "Wait," said Gregson, huskily. "Phil, you are breaking my heart. Listen. You got my note? But I did not desert you so abominably. I made a discovery that last night of yours in Churchill. I went to Eileen Brokaw, and tomorrow, sometime, if you care, I will tell you of all that happened. First, you must know this. I have found the power that is fighting you down below. I have found the man who is behind the plot to ruin your company, the man who is responsible for Thorpe's crimes, the man who is responsible for that in there." He leaned across the table and pointed to the closed door. "And that man," for a moment he seemed to choke, "is Brokaw, the father of my affianced wife." "Good God!" cried Philip. "Gregson, are you mad?" "I was almost mad when I first made the discovery," said Gregson, as cold as ice. "But I am sane now. His scheme was to have the government annul your provincial license. Thorpe and his men were to destroy this camp and kill you. The money on hand from stock, over $600,000, would have gone into Brokaw's pockets. There is no need of further detail, now, for you can understand. He knew Thorpe, and secured him as his agent. It was merely a whim of Thorpe's to take the name of Lord Fitzhugh instead of something less conspicuous. 3 months before Brokaw came to Churchill, he wished to get detailed instructions to Thorpe, which he dared not trust to a wilderness mail service. He could find no messenger whom he dared trust. So he sent Eileen. She was at Fort o' God for a week. Then she came to Churchill, where we saw her. The scheme was that Brokaw should bribe the ship's captain to run close into Blind Eskimo Point, at night, and signal to Thorpe and Eileen, who would be waiting. It worked, and Eileen and Thorpe came on with the ship. At the landing, you remember, Eileen was met by the girl from Fort o' God. In order not to betray herself to you, she refused to recognize her. Later she told her father, and Thorpe and Brokaw saw in it an opportunity to strike a first blow. Brokaw had brought 2 men whom he could trust, and Thorpe had 4 or 5 others at Churchill. The attack on the cliff followed, the object being to kill the man, but take the girl unharmed. A messenger was to take the news of what happened to Fort o' God, and lay the crime to men who had run up to Churchill from your camp. Chance favored you that night, and you spoiled their plan. Chance favored me, and I found Eileen. It is useless for me to go into detail as to what happened after that, except to say this, that Eileen knew nothing of the proposed attack, that she was ignorant of the heinousness of the plot against you, and that she was almost as much a tool of her father as you. Phil," for the first time there came a pleading light into Gregson's eyes, as he leaned across the table, "Phil, if it wasn't for Eileen, I would not be here. I thought that she would kill herself when I told her as much of the story as I knew. She told me what she had done. She confessed for her father. In that hour of her agony I could not keep back my love. We plotted. I forged a letter, and made it possible to accompany Brokaw and Eileen up the Churchill. It was not my purpose to join you, and so Eileen professed to be taken ill. We camped, back from the river, and I sent our 2 Indians back to Churchill, for Eileen and I wished to be alone with Brokaw in the terrible hour that was coming. That is all. Everything is revealed. I have come to you as quickly as I could, to find that Thorpe is dead. In my own selfishness I would have shielded Brokaw, arguing that he could pay Thorpe, and work honorably henceforth. You would never have known. It is Eileen who makes this confession, not I. Phil, her last words to me were these: 'You love me, then you will tell him all this. Only after this, if he shows us a mercy which we do not deserve, can I be your wife.' There is only one other thing to add. I have shown Brokaw a ray of hope. He will hand over to you all his rights in the company and the 600,000 in the treasury. He will sign over to you, as repurchase money for whatever stock you wish to call in, practically his whole fortune, 500,000. He will disappear, completely and forever. Eileen and I will hunt out our own little corner in a new world, and you will never hear of us again. This is what we have planned to do, if you show us mercy." Philip had not spoken during Gregson's terrible recital. He sat like one turned to stone. Rage, wonder, and horror burned so fiercely in his heart that they consumed all evidence of emotion. And to arouse him now there came an interruption that sent the blood flushing back into his face. A low knock at the closed door, a slow lifting of the latch, the appearance of Jeanne. Through her tears she saw only the man she loved, and sobbing aloud now like a child, she stretched out her arms to him. And when he sprang to her and caught her to his breast, she whispered his name again and again, and stroked his face with her hands. Love, overpowering, breathing of heaven, was in her touch, and as she lifted her face to him of her own sweet will now, entreating him to kiss her and to comfort her for what she had lost, he saw Gregson moving with bowed head, like a stricken thing, toward the outer door. In that moment the things that had been in his heart melted away, and raising a hand above his head, he called softly, "Tom Gregson, my old chum, if you have found a love like this, thank your God. My own love I would lose if I destroyed yours. Go back to Eileen. Tell Brokaw that I accept his offers. And when you come back in a few days, bring Eileen. My Jeanne will love her." And Jeanne, looking from Philip's face, saw Gregson for the first time as he passed through the door. End of chapter 23. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 24 of Flower of the North. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Flower of the North by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 24. Both Philip and Jeanne were silent for some moments after Gregson had gone. Their only movement was the gentle stroking of Philip's hand over the girl's soft hair. Their hearts were full, too full for speech. And yet he knew that upon his strength depended everything now. The revelations of Gregson, which virtually ended the fight against him personally, were but trivial in his thoughts compared with the ordeal which was ahead of Jeanne. Both Pierre and her father were dead, and with the exception of Jeanne, no one but he knew of the secret that had died with them. He could feel against him the throbbing of the storm that was passing in the girl's heart, and in answer to it he said nothing in words, but held her to him with a gentleness that lifted her face, quiet and beautiful, so that her eyes looked steadily and questioningly into his own. "You love me," she said, simply, and yet with a calmness that sent a curious thrill through him. "Beyond all else in the world," he replied. She still looked at him, without speaking, as though through his eyes she was searching to the bottom of his soul. "And you know," she whispered, after a moment. He drew her so close she could not move, and crushed his face down against her own. "Jeanne, everything is as it should be," he said. "I am glad that you were found out in the snows. I am glad that the woman in the picture was your mother. I would have nothing different than it is, for if things were different you would not be the Jeanne that I know, and I would not love you so. You have suffered, sweetheart, and I, too, have had my share of sorrow. God has brought us together, and all is right in the end. Jeanne, my sweet Jeanne." Gregson had left the outer door slightly ajar. A gust of wind opened it wider. Through it there came now a sound that interrupted the words on Philip's lips and sent a sudden quiver through Jeanne. In an instant both recognized the sound. It was the firing of rifles, the shots coming to them faintly from far beyond the mountain at the end of the lake. Moved by the same impulse, they ran to the door hand in hand. "It is Sachigo!" panted Jeanne. She could hardly speak. She seemed to struggle to get breath. "I had forgotten. They are fighting." MacDougall strode up from his post behind the door, where he had been waiting for the appearance of Jeanne. "Firing off there," he said. "What does it mean?" "We must wait and see," replied Philip. "Send 2 of your men to investigate, Mac. I will rejoin you after I have taken Miss D'Arcambal over to Cassidy's wife." He moved away quickly with Jeanne. On a sudden rise of the wind from the south the firing came to them more distinctly. Then it died away, and ended in 3 or 4 intermittent shots. For the space of a dozen seconds a strange stillness followed, and then over the mountain top, where there was still a faint glow in the sky, there came the low, quavering, triumphal cry of the Crees. A cry born of the forest itself, mournful even in its joy, only half human, almost like a faraway burst of tongue from a wolf pack on the hunt trail. And after that there was an unbroken silence. "It is over," breathed Philip. He felt Jeanne's fingers tighten about his own. "No one will ever know," he continued. "Even MacDougall will not guess what has happened out there tonight." He stopped a dozen paces from Cassidy's cabin. The windows were aglow, and they could hear the laughter and play of Cassidy's 2 children within. Gently he drew Jeanne to him. "You will stay here tonight, dear," he said. "Tomorrow we will go to Fort o' God." "You must take me home tonight," whispered Jeanne, looking up into his face. "I must go, Philip. Send someone with me, and you can come in the morning with Pierre." She put her hand to his face again, in the sweet touch that told more of her love than 1,000 words. "You understand, dear?" she went on, seeing the anxiety in his eyes. "I have the strength tonight. I must return to father, and he will know everything when you come to Fort o' God." "I will send MacDougall with you," said Philip after a moment. "And then I will follow." "With Pierre?" "Yes, with Pierre." For a brief space longer they stood outside of Cassidy's cabin. And then Philip, lifting her face, said gently, "Will you kiss me, dear? It is the first time." He bent down, and Jeanne's lips reached his own. "No, it is not the first time," she confessed, in a whisper. "Not since that day, when I thought you were dying, after we came through the rapids." 5 minutes later Philip returned to MacDougall. Roberts, Henshaw, Cassidy, and Lecault were with the engineer. "I've sent the St. Pierres to find out about the firing," he said. "Look at the crowd over at the store. Every one heard it, and they've seen the fire on the mountain. They think the Indians have cornered a moose or two and are shooting them by the blaze." "They're probably right," said Philip. "I want a word with you, Mac." He walked a little aside with the engineer, leaving the others in a group, and in a low voice told him as much as he cared to reveal about the identity of Thorpe and Gregson's mission in camp. Then he spoke of Jeanne. "I believe that the death of Thorpe practically ends all danger to us," he concluded. "I'm going to offer you a pleasanter job than fighting, Mac. It is imperative that Miss d'Arcambal should return to D'Arcambal House before morning, and I want you to take her if you will. I'm choosing the best man I've got because she's going to be my wife, Mac. I'm the happiest man on earth tonight." MacDougall did not show surprise. "Guessed it," he said, shortly, thrusting out a hand and grinning broadly into Philip's face. "Couldn't help from seeing, Phil. And the firing, and Thorpe, and that half-breed in there." Understanding was slowly illuminating his face. "You'll know all about them a little later, Mac," said Philip softly. "Tonight we must investigate nothing, very far. Miss d'Arcambal must be taken home immediately. Will you go?" "With pleasure." "She can ride one of the horses as far as the Little Churchill," continued Philip, "and there she will show you a canoe. I will follow in the morning with the body of Pierre, the half-breed." A quarter of an hour later MacDougall and Jeanne set out over the river trail, leaving Philip standing behind, watching them until they were hidden in the night. It was fully an hour later before the St. Pierres returned. Philip was uneasy until the two dark-faced hunters came into the little offices and leaned their rifles against the wall. He had feared that Sachigo might have left some trace of his ambush behind. But the St. Pierres had discovered nothing, and could give only one reason for the burning pine on the summit of the mountain. They agreed that Indians had fired it to frighten moose from a thick cover to the south and west, and that their hunt had been a failure. It was midnight before Philip relaxed his caution, which he maintained until then in spite of his belief that Thorpe's men, under Blake, had met a quick finish at the hands of Sachigo and his ambushed braves. His men left for their cabins, with the exception of Cassidy, whom he asked to spend the remainder of the night in one of the office bunks. Alone, he went in to prepare Pierre for his last journey to Fort o' God. A lamp was burning low beside the bunk in which Pierre lay. Philip approached, and turned the wick higher, and then he gazed in wonder upon the transfiguration in the half-breed's face. Pierre had died with a smile on his lips, and with a curious thickening in his throat Philip thought that those lips, even in death, were carved in the act of whispering Jeanne's name. It seemed to him, as he stood in silence for many moments, that Pierre was not dead, but that he was sleeping a quiet, unbreathing sleep in which there came to him visions of the great love for which he had offered up his life and his soul. Jeanne's hands, in his last moments, had stilled all pain. Peace slumbered in the pale shadows of his closed eyes. The great God of his faith had come to him in his hour of greatest need on earth, and he had passed away into the valley of silent men on the sweet breath of Jeanne's prayers. The girl had crossed his hands upon his breast. She had brushed back his long hair. Philip knew that she had imprinted a kiss upon the silent lips before the soul had fled, and in the warmth and knowledge of that kiss Pierre had died happy. And Philip, brokenly, said aloud, "God bless you, Pierre, old man." He lifted the cold hands back, and gently drew the covers which had hidden the telltale stains of death from Jeanne's eyes. He turned down Pierre's shirt, and in the lamp-glow there glistened the golden locket. For the first time he noticed it closely. It was half as large as the palm of his hand, and very thin, and he saw that it was bent and twisted. A shudder ran through him when he understood what had happened. The bullet that had killed Pierre had first struck the locket, and had burst it partly open. He took it in his hand, and then he saw that through the broken side there protruded the end of a bit of paper. For a brief space the discovery made him almost forget the presence of death. Pierre had never opened the locket, because it was of the old-fashioned kind that locked with a key, and the key was gone. And the locket had been about Jeanne's neck when he found her out in the snows. Was it possible that this bit of paper had something to do with the girl he loved? Carefully, so that it would not tear, he drew it forth. There was writing on the paper, as he had expected, and he read it, bent low beside the lamp. The date was nearly 18 years old. The lines were faint. The words were these: "My husband, God can never undo what I have done. I have dragged myself back, repentant, loving you more than I have ever loved you in my life, to leave our little girl with you. She is your daughter and mine. She was born on the 8th day of September, the 7th month after I left Fort o' God. She is yours, and so I bring her back to you, with the prayer that she would help to fill the true and noble heart that I have broken. I cannot ask your forgiveness, for I do not deserve it. I cannot let you see me, for I should kill myself at your feet. I have lived this long only for the baby. I will leave her where you cannot fail to find her, and by the time you have read this I will have answered for my sin, my madness, if you can have charity regard it so. And if God is kind I will hover about you always, and you will know that in death the old sweetheart and the mother has found what she could never again hope for in life. Your wife." Philip rose slowly erect and gazed down into the still, tranquil face of Pierre, the half-breed. "Why didn't you open it?" he whispered. "Why didn't you open it? My God, what it would have saved!" For a full minute he looked down at Pierre, as though he expected that the white lips would move and answer him. And then he thought of Jeanne hurrying to Fort o' God, and of the terrible things which she was to reveal to her father that night. She was D'Arcambal's own daughter. What pain, what agony of father and child he might have saved if he had examined the locket a little sooner! He looked at his watch and found that Jeanne had been gone 3 hours. It would be impossible to overtake MacDougall and the girl unless something had occurred to delay them somewhere along the trail. He hurried back into the little room where he had left Cassidy. In a few words he explained that it was necessary for him to follow Jeanne and the engineer to D'Arcambal House without a moment's delay, and he directed Cassidy to take charge of camp affairs and to send Pierre's body with a suitable escort the next day. "It isn't necessary for me to tell you what to do," he finished. "You understand." Cassidy nodded. 6 months before he had buried his youngest child under a big spruce back of his cabin. Philip hastened to the stables and, choosing one of the lighter animals, was soon galloping over the trail toward the Little Churchill. In his face there blew a cold wind from Hudson's Bay, and now and then he felt the sting of fine particles in his eyes. They were the presage of storm. A shifting of the wind a little to the east and south, and the fine particles would thicken and turn into snow. By morning the world would be white. He came into the forests beyond the plain, and in the spruce and the cedar tops the wind was half a gale, filling the night with wailing and moaning sounds that sent strange shivers through him as he thought of Pierre in the cabin. In such a way, he imagined, had the north wind swept across the cold barrens on the night that Pierre had found the woman and the babe. And now it seemed, in his fancies, as though above and about him the great hand that had guided the half-breed then was bringing back the old night, as if Pierre, in dying, had wished it so. For the wind changed. The fine particles thickened and changed to snow. And then there was no longer the wailing and the moaning in the tree tops, but the soft murmur of a white deluge that smothered him in a strange gloom and hid the trail. There were 2 canoes concealed at the end of the trail on the Little Churchill, and Philip chose the smallest. He followed swiftly after MacDougall and Jeanne. He could no longer see either side of the stream, and he was filled with a fear that he might pass the little creek that led to Fort o' God. He timed himself by his watch, and when he had paddled for 2 hours he ran in close to the west shore, traveling so slowly that he did not progress a mile in half an hour. And then suddenly, from close ahead, there rose through the snow gloom the dismal howl of a dog, which told him that he was near to Fort o' God. He found the black opening that marked the entrance to the creek, and when he ran upon the sandbar 100 yards beyond, he saw lights burning in the great room where he had first seen D'Arcambal. He went now where Pierre had led him that night, and found the door unlocked. He entered silently, and passed down the dark hall until, on the left, he saw a glow of light that came from the big room. Something in the silence that was ahead of him made his own approach without sound, and softly he entered through the door. In the great chair sat the master of Fort o' God, his gray head bent. At his feet knelt Jeanne, and so close were they that D'Arcambal's face was hidden in Jeanne's shining, disheveled hair. No sooner had Philip entered the room than his presence seemed to arouse the older man. He lifted his head slowly, looking toward the door, and when he saw who stood there he raised one of his arms from about the girl and held it out to Philip. "My son!" he said. In a moment Philip was upon his knees beside Jeanne, and one of D'Arcambal's heavy hands fell upon his shoulder in a touch that told him he had come too late to keep back any part of the terrible story which Jeanne had bared to him. The girl did not speak when she saw him beside her. It was as if she had expected him to come, and her hand found his and nestled in it, as cold as ice. "I have hurried from the camp," he said. "I tried to overtake Jeanne. About Pierre's neck I found a locket, and in the locket was this." He looked into D'Arcambal's haggard face as he gave him the blood-stained note, and he knew that in the moment that was to come the master of Fort o' God and his daughter should be alone. "I will wait in the portrait room," he said in a low voice, and as he rose to his feet he pressed Jeanne's hand to his lips. The old room was as he had left it weeks before. The picture of Jeanne's mother still hung with its face to the wall. There was the same elusive movement of the portrait over the volume of warm air that rose from the floor. In this room he seemed to breathe again the presence of a warm spirit of life, as he had felt it on the first night, a spirit that seemed to him to be a part of Jeanne herself, and he thought of the last words of the wife and mother, of her promise to remain always near those whom she loved, to regain after death the companionship which she could never hope for in life. And then there came to him a thought of the vast and wonderful mystery of death, and he wondered if it was her spirit that had been with him more than one lonely night when his camp fire was low, if it was her presence that had filled him with transcendent dreams of hope and love, coming to him that night beside the rock at Churchill, and leading him at last to Jeanne, for whom she had given up her life. He heard again the rising of the wind outside and the beating of the storm against the window, and he went softly to see if his vision could penetrate into the white twisting gloom beyond the glass. For many minutes he stood, seeing nothing. And then he heard a sound, and turned to see Jeanne and her father standing in the door. Glory was in the face of the master of Fort o' God. He seemed not to see Philip. He seemed to see nothing but the picture that was turned against the wall. He strode across the room, his great shoulders straightened, his shaggy head erect, and with the pride of one revealing first to human eyes the masterpiece of his soul and life, he turned the picture so that the radiant face of the wife and mother looked down upon him. And was it fancy that for a fleeting moment the smile left the beautiful lips, and a light, soft and luminous, pleading for love and forgiveness, filled the eyes of Jeanne's mother? Philip trembled. Jeanne came across to him silently and crept into his arms. And then, slowly, the master of Fort o' God turned toward them and stretched out both of his great arms. "My children!" he said. End of chapter 24. Recording by Roger Moline.